Chapter 4291. Jie. Along with the sound of hurried footsteps, Gong Jie heard a familiar voice and looked up. Alice rushed over in a hurry, only to see a group of people sitting at the door of the ward. Through the window, she saw Yun Shirshir lying on the bed and was dumbfounded. What's going on? Gong Jie and Mu Yaja looked at each other. Both of them thought that it was the other who had called them over. Were you the one who called? Mu Yaja's first reaction was this. Gong Jie was stunned. He thought that Mu Yaja had called Alice over. Don't guess anymore, Alice explained. When I saw that Hua Jin and you didn't come home for so long, leaving Alice alone, I guessed that something must have happened, so I called to ask. Sure enough. What's going on? Gong Jie and Mu Yaja looked at each other. It was obvious that Gong Fan was sitting here now and it was a taboo. Alice was also very smart. Seeing that everyone was silent, she guessed that this matter must have something to do with Gong Fan. She didn't intend to pursue the matter, but in the end, Gong Fan said very calmly, I remember that there are surveillance cameras in the room, right? Let's check the surveillance footage. How about it? In a normal ward, there were no surveillance cameras. However, in the VIP suites, other than the bathroom, there were surveillance cameras. There were also 2 surveillance cameras installed in the direction of the bed. And when a normal patient needed to change their dressing and expose their body, there was a curtain on the bed that could be pulled up to cover them. Gong Fan's request to see the surveillance footage was unexpected. Gong Jie didn't even think of checking the surveillance footage. Most people didn't even notice the surveillance cameras in the ward. But Gong Fan noticed it. It was not difficult to obtain the authorization to play the surveillance video. With such authorization, Mu Yaja only needed to make a phone call, and the hospital sent people to respectfully welcome them into the surveillance center. Xiao Yichen was still agitated. Mu Yaja asked him to guard Yun Shirshir while the others entered the surveillance center. They retrieved the video recording, adjusted the time, and began to play it. It happened in the afternoon of the same day. When the incident happened, Yun Shirshir was sitting by the bed peeling an apple. Halfway through peeling, she realized that Gong Fan had woken up. She immediately put the half-peeled apple and fruit knife aside and went over. The video was silent. Hence, no one knew what Yun Shirshir said to Gong Fan. However, from the video, half of Gong Fan's face was blocked by Yun Shirshir's body. It just so happened that from this angle, one could see his increasingly cold eyes. His gaze suddenly turned to the apple on the bedside table. Yun Shirshir also noticed his gaze and immediately smiled. Her mouth moved. Without thinking, she must have thought that Gong Fan wanted to eat the apple. Hence, she probably said that she had peeled the apple for him. Gong Fan didn't move and sat stiffly on the bed. Yun Shirshir took the apple and continued to peel it. When the apple was cut into the fruit bag, Gong Fan suddenly reached out. However, he didn't want to take the fruit bag. Instead, he snatched the fruit knife from her hand. Yun Shirshir's expression changed. She didn't even have time to stand up before Gong Fan made his move. He raised the fruit knife fiercely and stabbed it into her abdomen. Chapter 4292. This was exactly the same as what he had seen in his dream. How could this be? In that case, what he had seen back then was not a dream, but real. Had he really stabbed Yun Shirshir with his own hands? Impossible. He was not the one who had controlled his body. Gong Fan's thoughts were in a mess. He hugged his head and felt a splitting headache. Alice watched the video seriously until Xiao Yichen appeared and stopped him in time. It was too dangerous. If Mu Yichen had not appeared in time, Yun Shirshir's life would have been in danger. It was no wonder that Mu Yichen hated Gong Fan to the core. After witnessing such a terrifying scene with his own eyes, he still had a lingering fear. Just thinking about it, if he had not stopped it in time, the second stab would not have been in the abdomen, but in the lung. If the lung was punctured, then even if Huata was alive, he would not be able to save the situation. It's not me. Gong Fan clasped his wrist in frustration. He remembered that in the video and in the nightmare, it was this hand that had stabbed Yun Shirshir ruthlessly. He clenched his wrist tightly, as if he wanted to break this evil hand. But it was really not him. Why did this happen? Could there be a cold-blooded demon living in his body? Or, he really did it himself? Gong Fan did not know who to believe. He had never thought that existence would be so tiring. He even imagined that if he had quit early on, he would have self-destructed. Perhaps this would not have happened. Was his existence really a scourge? Gong Fan could not stop doubting himself over and over again. After Alice finished watching the video, she did not continue watching it. She already knew what to do and ended the video. When she turned around, she saw that everyone had different expressions. She pondered for a moment, then smiled at Muyaja and said, "Young Master Mu, you guys can leave first. I have something to talk to Gong Fan alone." When Muyaja heard this, he looked at Gong Fan worriedly, only to see him lowering his head, clenching his hands tightly and frowning. No one knew what he was thinking and his heart ached. Alice immediately said, don't worry, I'm here, nothing will happen." When Gong Jie heard what Alice said, he knew that there were some things that he and Muyaja could not hear. Hence, he said to Muyaja, "Let's go out." The two of them then walked out. After the two of them left the control room, only Alice and Gong Fan were left in the huge room. At that moment, Alice said in a low voice, "I know you didn't do it." When Gong Fan heard this, his eyes were fiercely startled. He originally thought that Alice's first sentence would be to question him. He did not expect that she would actually believe him. You believe me? You know, sometimes a person's eyes can deceive and affect one's rational judgment. Alice said seriously, "Putting all these aside, I can't think of any motive for you to stab your mommy. Even if you really killed her, what good would it do you?" Gong Fan was silent for a long time. Finally, he decided to tell her everything that had happened to him. "I had a dream." "A dream?" Gong Fan told Alice in detail what he had seen in his dream. When Alice heard this, her face fell. Chapter 4293. How could this be? Was I dreaming or did you have an out-of-body experience? I don't know what it feels like to have an out-of-body experience, but I felt as if I was looking at everything from God's point of view. That's right. Alice snapped her fingers and explained seriously, "At that time, the personality that controlled this body was not you." Then, Gong Fan was even more incredulous. "Could it be you? That's impossible. How could he do that?" "This is what worries me the most. It's not you, and it can't be you. Then, who was the person controlling that body?" If one thought about it deeply, they could not help but be terrified. Alice could not be sure what had happened in Gong Fan's body. But there was one thing that she could guarantee with her life. The hand holding the knife did not come from Gong Fan. Could it be? Alice suddenly had a very scary thought. She stood up and said to Gong Fan, "Are you willing to believe me this once?" Gong Fan looked up and looked at Alice, only to see that her eyes were filled with determination. "Believe what?" "Believe that I can help you," Alice said solemnly, "but you need to go back to Hurricane with me. By then, I will design a treatment plan. We can't wait any longer. Your condition is not optimistic. You have to be treated and monitored as soon as possible." "Go back to Hurricane with you?" "Yes. But I'm afraid that your mommy won't agree. She has been very worried that I will take you away." Before Alice could finish, Gong Fan said firmly, "I'm willing to go back with you." Alice was slightly surprised. "You're willing to go back with me?" "But I have a condition." Gong Fan suddenly stood up and closed his eyes, as if he had finally made his final decision. "No matter what happens, no matter if my condition gets better or worse, please, protect you and destroy me," he said the last 3 words through gritted teeth. Alice felt slightly suffocated. She didn't know why Gong Fan made such a decision. She guessed that it was probably for Yu and, more importantly, for Yun Shirshir. However, it was hard to imagine how much courage it took for him to make such a decision. A person's survival instinct was very strong. What kind of pressure and courage did Gong Fan have to bear to face death like this? To an ordinary person, the destruction of one's personality was equivalent to death. It wasn't that he didn't want to survive. On the contrary, he wanted to live well. "It's good to be alive." Gong Fan said honestly, "When you're alive, you can see a lot of beautiful scenery and be with the person you like. However, if one's life is built on the pain of others, then such an existence is meaningless." As he spoke, Gong Fan gradually choked up. He immediately turned his gaze away and narrowed his eyes. He tried his best to force back the tears that were about to burst out of his eyes and clenched his fists. I'll go back with you, but you have to agree to my condition. If I do that, your mommy will never forgive me. Chapter 4294. Gong Fan smiled self-deprecatingly. My existence is a mistake in itself. Since it's a mistake, it's better to end this mistake as soon as possible. After he finished speaking, he looked down helplessly. He had tried his best and struggled before. He had put down his pride and compromised. He had carefully changed and abandoned his pride to please Gong Jie, Mu Yaja, and Hua Jin. He wanted everyone to like him as much as they liked Yu. He had ignored his weak pride just to give everyone a reason to keep him. He had curled up in such a shell and struggled at death's door. Even if it was just for one more day or one more glance, he still wanted to exist in this world. But he had given up. He had really given up. Alice held her forehead helplessly. You want me to become a heinous person. In this way, your mommy will never forgive me. I'll be an executioner who has killed the person she loves the most. Gong Fan gritted his teeth tightly. He had never shown such a weak side in front of anyone before. It was only in front of Alice that he finally couldn't suppress the sadness and disappointment in his heart. Alice knew that whether it was Gong Jie, Mu Yaja, or Xiao Yichen, Gong Fan cared too much about them. Hence, he was never willing to show such a side in front of them easily. On the other hand, she was an outsider, yet he was able to cast aside his burdens. Her heart ached as she walked over and gently hugged his shoulders. She stroked his shoulders that were trembling badly because of his forbearance. If you want to cry, it's okay to cry. If you keep enduring like this, even a body of steel won't be able to take it. Gong Fan didn't say anything. However, Alice could faintly hear a few choked sobs coming out from the gaps between his teeth. The more he endured, the more Alice's heart ached. Luckily, Yun Shirshir wasn't here. Otherwise, her heart would definitely be completely broken because of this guy. In the end, Gong Fan didn't cry out loud. He grabbed the corner of Alice's clothes tightly and suppressed his sadness. Promise me, he said in a low voice, I don't want to be a burden to you anymore. It's best for everyone if I disappear. Alice pursed her lips with a complicated expression and finally nodded reluctantly. Looks like I'm going to be a vicious woman again? What? You want to take Gong Fan away? Gong Jie stood in front of Alice and refused without thinking. Impossible, he said firmly. I won't let you take him away. Please, you have to understand one thing. It's not that I want to take him away, it's that he wants to follow me. Gong Jie, I don't care. Why don't you go and convince your nephew yourself? Moreover, with his current situation, what good would it do for him to stay by your side? It was like a cancer patient who insisted on staying at home instead of going to the authoritative hospital. Would it work? Do you think keeping him by your side is the best way to protect him? Alice's sharp words made Gong Jie speechless. Chapter 4295. Gong Jie remained silent. Now that Yun Shirshir was still unconscious, he couldn't make a decision on his own. He couldn't make the decision to let Alice take Gong Fan away. This was the crux of the problem. He also felt that if Gong Fan could return to Hurricane with Alice, it might be a good choice for Gong Fan. However, he couldn't make a decision. If Yun Shirshir wakes up and realizes that Gong Fan isn't around, she will definitely go crazy. Alice was speechless. She held her forehead and said, Why do I feel that she is the one who can't be independent? Gong Jie was stunned. Alice said, Yun Shirshir once said that Yu is so dependent on her. In my opinion, she is the one who is more dependent on Yu. Their mother-son relationship has reached a stalemate. Yu is dependent on her because Yun Shirshir needs him. On the other hand, Yun Shirshir is dependent on her out of guilt and out of motherly love. However, more importantly, she is used to being inseparable from her son and wants to protect him to achieve her own satisfaction. In the end, don't you think that this kind of dependence is very sick? She can protect Yu for a while, but can she protect him forever? Gong Jie was speechless. She just cares too much. If she cares too much, it will become a kind of sickness. This won't do. If she continues to rely on Yu, then she won't be able to live without him in the future. In the end, whether it is Yu or Xiao Yichen, they are just passers-by in her life. In the end, the person who will be with her and spend the rest of her life with her is not Yu, not Xiao Yichen. It is Mu Yaja. They are husband and wife. Their lives are tied together. Upon hearing this, Gong Jie finally spoke. I think so too. She is too dependent on Yu and cares too much about him. Whether it is out of a desire to protect him or out of heartache, but this is not a long-term thing. Alice added, it may not be a good thing for Yu to stay here. First of all, it is disadvantageous to not be able to monitor his physical and mental condition. If he comes back to Hurricane with me, perhaps this situation can be greatly improved. Gong Jie nodded his head in agreement. Okay, got it. How about this? You and Mu Yaja? If he agrees, you can take him away. Okay. Alice stood up and said, got it. Alice took the initiative to discuss this matter with Mu Yaja. When Mu Yaja heard this, he did not feel as conflicted as Alice had imagined. To him, there was a difference between him and Yun Shirshir. Although he loved Yu, he did not rely on him as much as Yun Shirshir. On the contrary, Mu Yaja felt that it was a good choice for Yu and Gong Fan to follow Alice back to Hurricane. You can take him away. Seeing that he actually agreed, Alice was a little surprised. I thought you would refuse. Why? Because you are afraid that she will erase his memory again? Alice did not comment. First of all, excluding other factors, you erased his memory because of Gong Xiaoying's order, right? You can't go against him. You can only follow his orders. Chapter 4296. Mu Yaja laughed heartily. If that's the case, what do I have to worry about? However, other than Yu, I have to bring someone with me. Who? Mu Yaja looked at her. Alice looked around and her gaze finally fell on Hua Jin. Hua Jin suddenly felt uneasy. Natalia. Hearing this name from Alice, Hua Jin felt inexplicably upset. Must I bring her with me? Yes, I must. Yu's condition was initially stabilizing, but the recent changes in his condition have something to do with Natalia, she answered truthfully. It's hard to disentangle her involvement. I suspect that Gong Fan's condition must have something to do with Natalia. So, I have to bring her with me. When Hua Jin heard this, he nodded helplessly. You can bring her with you, and I can't interfere. However, I have to make one thing clear. Can I go back to Hurricane with you? You want to go back to Hurricane with me? Alice glanced at him speechlessly. That's not a place for you to stay. Why? You won't be used to it. There's nothing to be used to. If I go back with you, I can help to take care of the two little guys. With me around, Shirshir will be more at ease. What I mean is, Alice leaned closer to him. Are you sure you want to go back with me? Aren't you afraid of Gong Jie? In other words, he was walking into a demon's den. Hua Jin then realized that Gong Jie came back to Hurricane every 2 to 3 days. If that was the case, Hua Jin might have to face this demon king from time to time. Hua Jin's lips twitched for a long time before he finally braced himself and said, It's okay. I'm okay. Okay, if that's the case, go back and pack your luggage now. We'll fly back to Hurricane tomorrow morning. All right. Hua Jin immediately took a taxi back to the villa and packed his luggage. At night, Yun Shirshir finally heard that the postoperative infection period had passed. She was out of danger and could visit her now. Gong Fan suggested that before he left, he wanted to take a look at his mommy and bid her farewell. However, Xiao Yichen was still worried. Hence, with Mu Yaja's silent approval, Xiao Yichen stood guard outside the ward. Gong Fan knew very well that Xiao Yichen was worried that he would go crazy again, but he wasn't angry at all. After experiencing the scene on the surveillance camera, he knew that he was now a dangerous person. It wasn't unreasonable for Xiao Yichen to be so wary of him. He was already surprised that Xiao Yichen agreed to let Gong Fan into the ward. After Gong Fan entered the ward, Xiao Yichen warned him in a low voice, I'm warning you, don't play any tricks. Even if I'm so far away from you, I have the ability to take you down in 3 seconds. Gong Fan took a deep breath and suddenly smiled. Got it. Xiao Yichen originally thought that Gong Fan would flare up, but when he saw that he was very calm, he was a little surprised instead. However, he didn't say anything and just leaned against the door, his gaze never leaving Gong Fan's back. Gong Fan walked to the bed and sat down by it. The temperature in the ward was just right. He sat on the chair and quietly looked at Yun Shirshir. Chapter 4297. Mu Yaja had told him not to wake her up easily. Now that her wound had just been stitched up, she finally fell asleep after being injected with an analgesic pump. Gong Fan could not bear to wake her up, so he stayed by her side quietly. He gently held her hand and pressed his face against the back of her hand, greedily absorbing the warmth from the back of her hand. He did not know if this was the last time he could hold her hand. Now, every minute and second that passed was extremely precious to him. "Why are you packing?" Natalia looked at Hua Jin, who was busy packing, and was a little puzzled. "Are you going on a long trip?" Hua Jin packed his luggage and replied, "It's not me. It's us." Natalia was a little surprised. "Are you going somewhere to play?" "No." Hua Jin did not know how to explain. Natalia was too sensitive. If he said that she needed to go back to Hurricane for treatment because of her body, she would definitely reject it. He remembered that Natalia used to hate anyone who stayed by her side in the name of monitoring her. For example, Alice. Whether it was Natalia or the other person, Generisa, they were extremely uncomfortable. Natalia had said solemnly that she was not a patient. Hua Jin did not know how to explain it. Natalia stared at him. Finally, she sighed. "It's because of my body, isn't it?" "You?" Hua Jin was a little surprised by her sensitivity. She was even more sensitive than he had imagined. "Actually, I know that I'm different from ordinary children." Natalia walked to the side a little dejectedly and said sadly, "Other than not having parents, I also know that my body is different from other children. Professor Romanka once said that there are other personalities living in my body." Hua Jin said, "In the past, you hated it when people said that you were sick." "Yes, because I feel that I'm not sick. I feel that they have ulterior motives towards me. I hate those people." When Hua Jin heard this, he could not help guessing that the people Natalia was referring to were the doctors and nurses from Michelle Hospital. "I hate them, especially staying in that cold place. I feel that they look at me like they're looking at an emotionless corpse." As Natalia spoke, she turned around and looked at Hua Jin with a gentler gaze. "But you're different. If you say that I'm sick, then I believe that I'm really sick. You are willing to believe me?" Hua Jin looked a little incredulous. Natalia's trust was very weak. From the first time he saw her, especially when she looked at him with an extremely resistant gaze, he knew that this child was very insecure. "I know I have a sister. Her name is Natalisa. The professor told me about her. However, I also know that she is not my sister. Her existence is just another me." Hua Jin was a little surprised to hear that. "What did the professor tell you?" Chapter 4298. "At that time, he told you that he was your sister, so you believed him?" "But later, I started to have doubts about this story." "Why?" "At that time, a lot of people looked at me like I was a patient. I hated those looks, but gradually I realized that I was really sick. Sometimes I would sleep for a long time. When I fell asleep, I would secretly write in my diary. When I woke up, I would find that the calendar had already flipped to the next page. Sometimes, I couldn't even tell if I was in a dream or in reality. I felt like my body had been taken over by another person, and that person was Natalia. After all, Natalia was still a child. Her ability to organize her words was not very good. However, from her words, it was clear that she had many questions about her own body. I actually felt that there was something wrong with my body a long time ago. I even realized that the professor was using me as a test subject." "Test subject?" "He seemed to be using me as a test subject." Natalia continued, "So, when Alice wanted to take me away, I was very against it. Because Alice and the professor were in cahoots. She must have wanted to use me as a test subject." Hua Jin managed to glean a lot of key clues from her words. "Wait, you said that you suspected that the professor was using you as a test subject. How did you know?" Natalia turned to look at Hua Jin, and her eyes flickered. Hua Jin could tell that she was weighing the pros and cons in her heart. She was weighing whether to believe him or not. Her trust was very weak. She must be fighting in her heart right now whether to believe him or not. He was a little nervous. Just as he suspected that Natalia would not believe him and tell him everything, Natalia sighed. I believe you, so I'll tell you what I know. This is all my secrets. You can't tell anyone else. Okay. Natalia began to talk tirelessly. It turned out that not only Alice and Hua Jin, but even Natalia had discovered the secret on the calendar. She had the habit of keeping a diary. However, unlike other people, she did not like to write in a diary. Her diary was to record the day when she was awake. Sometimes, she would mark it with stickers on the bedside. Other times, she would secretly write down the day's events and the date on the floor under the bed. That was an extremely secluded corner that most people would not be able to find. Later, she concluded that she would sometimes sleep for 3 to 4 days. Whenever she was unconscious, a circle would be used to mark the day. Every day, Romanka would come to her room to look at the calendar. She couldn't help but suspect that the change in her body had something to do with Professor Romanka. On one occasion, Natalia had played a trick on the sly. She took out an identical calendar from the drawer. When she woke up, she secretly changed the calendar and circled the date with a marker. She realized that perhaps there were two of her in her body. One was her current self, and the other was something that even she couldn't control. Chapter 4299. Hearing this, Hua Jin could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. He did not expect Natalia to be so shrewd as to tamper with the calendar. If that was the case, during the few days when Alice was monitoring her, did she wake up a few times and mark the calendar not with the real Natalia but Natalia? He did not dare to ask. Once he asked, Natalia would definitely find out that they were monitoring her. Then, Natalia would definitely misunderstand them and have some ulterior motives. That day, after I changed the diary, I went to the balcony to bask in the sun. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the professor entered the room and went to the table to look at the calendar as usual. Then, he walked to the balcony, but he did not call my name. Natalia? Yes. He called me Natalia. When Natalia heard this, her eyes narrowed slightly. I immediately felt that there must be some connection between the professor and Natalia. When Hua Jin heard this, he was a little curious. And then? I pretended to be very calm. He called me Natalia, so I pretended to be Natalia. He said that he wanted to continue the lesson from last time, so I followed him to a laboratory. In that laboratory, another strange man appeared, and he taught me some very strange things. What things? Hypnotism? Natalia raised her eyebrows in confusion. I don't think I remember this term wrongly. I think it was hypnotism. Was that man holding a crystal ball? When Natalia heard this, she shook her head. If it wasn't, then what was it? Do you know the metronome used when playing the piano? Yes. A metronome. Did he only use a metronome? No, there was also a clock. A clock? Natalia continued. He began to teach me how to do experiments. I remember that he summoned an assistant to his side and began to demonstrate to me what hypnotism was. He first used a pacemaker and placed it in front of his assistant. Then he gave a long lecture. After a few minutes, the assistant was obviously sleepy, so he gently moved the needle. Then the assistant fainted? No, his eyes widened even more. Hua Jin was taken aback. Wasn't it hypnosis? Why was it different from what he had imagined? The assistant's eyes widened. Then, the man began to interrogate him about what had happened in the past 2 days. The man then told him that what had happened 2 days ago was just a dream and that he had to count down to 3 seconds so that he could forget it. Then he began to count down. When he reached the end, he snapped his fingers, and that person went limp and fainted. Hua Jin sighed. So, the real hypnotism is like this? I don't remember the details. That day, I also felt muddle-headed and scared. I was afraid that my identity would be exposed. Actually, I wasn't sure if the professor really believed that I was Natalia. I kept feeling that my performance was very bad. I was afraid that he would recognize me, so I was very careful. And then? I attended classes for a day. Chapter 4300. I keep feeling that the professor's attitude towards me that day was very strange. In the past, he was very gentle to me, but towards Natalia, he was condescending, as if he was the ruler. It was as if he was the one who created Natalia. Hua Jin understood. Natalia might not know, but Hua Jin knew. He heard from Alice that it was Professor Romanka who had created the second personality in Natalia's body. No wonder it was like that. Natalia said, Professor Romanka was very fierce, and his attitude towards me was different from before. Anyway, it felt quite strange. As she said that, she subconsciously shrank her shoulders. Obviously, she still had a lingering fear when she thought of Romanka's serious and terrifying look that day. Hua Jin hugged her, his heart aching. Alright, don't be afraid. I'll protect you in the future. I won't let you get hurt again. Natalia nodded gently and hugged him. Now, I'm going to bring you back to Hurricane. Are you willing? Hua Jin immediately raised his hand and swore, I will never hurt you. I will protect you with my life. Before Hua Jin could finish swearing, Natalia burst out laughing. Why did you have to swear like that? It's just like those male and female leads in TV dramas who swear eternal love, ha. Hua Jin was so embarrassed that the corners of his lips twitched. Natalia said again, Don't worry. Since I'm willing to go back to Hurricane with you, I won't suspect you anymore. Hua Jin finished packing his luggage. Alice called to say that the private jet would be parked at the tarmac of Huashan Airport. They had agreed to meet there. Mu Yaja also ordered someone to pack his luggage. After the butler brought the luggage to the hospital, Gong Fan was still in the ward, guarding Yun Shirshir closely. Gong Jia walked to the door of the ward and gently knocked on the door. It's time to go. The plane will come to pick you up in half an hour. Gong Fan heard it, but he acted as if he didn't hear it. He continued to sit in front of the hospital bed, but he clung onto the back of Yun Shirshir's hand even more greedily. Perhaps she didn't feel anything before, but now, when Gong Jia mentioned leaving, the sadness of parting grew in her heart. Mommy, I'm sorry. He gripped her hand tightly in frustration, tears of sadness falling from his eyes. Xiao Yichen was stunned when he saw this. He rarely saw Gong Fan cry. In his heart, Gong Fan was an extremely stubborn person. No matter what he encountered, he would rarely shed tears. It could be said that this was the first time he had seen his tears. Seeing his tears, Xiao Yichen's heart softened. He walked over and gently placed his hand on Gong Fan's shoulder. His tone also became gentler. Stop crying. He couldn't bear to see Gong Fan cry. Gong Fan looked up and finally stood up. He said seriously, Please take good care of Mommy when I'm not around. You don't have to say this. I'll definitely take good care of Mommy. This is my mission. Gong Fan took a deep breath and turned around. He still looked down at Yun Shirshir reluctantly. He lowered his head and gently kissed her forehead. Mommy, I'm leaving. He lowered his voice and was about to leave when he saw a drop of tear fall from the corner of Yun Shirshir's eye. Chapter 4301. Gong Fan's heart ached even more when he saw this. He didn't know why Yun Shirshir was still crying in someone's sleep. Could it be that she could hear his voice even when she was unconscious? Gong Fan was a little reluctant, so he said, Mommy, don't worry. Wait for me to come home, okay? Gong Jia pursed his lips. He couldn't bear to see such a scene and didn't dare to look anymore. He raised his wrist and looked at the time. Seeing that it was getting late, he immediately said, Let's go, don't waste any more time. It's not like we're parting forever. Gong Fan gritted his teeth and steeled his heart. He didn't look at Yun Shirshir again and almost rushed out of the door. Just as he walked out of the ward, Lisa arrived in time. She had just rushed to the hospital and saw that Gong Fan's eyes were red. She frowned and didn't know what had happened. On the way here, she only vaguely understood what had happened from the butler and Mu Yaja over the phone, but it wasn't in detail. How could she not believe that Gong Fan would stab Yun Shirshir with a knife personally? There must be some misunderstanding. What's going on? When Gong Jia saw Lisa, he didn't have time to explain anything. He lowered his voice and said, Gong Fan's condition has worsened. Alice suggested that we bring him and Natalia back to Hurricane for treatment. Back to Hurricane? When Lisa heard this, she immediately walked in front of Gong Fan and said to him, I'll go back with you. What? When Xiao Yichen saw this, he immediately walked out of the ward. You want to go back to the ward with him? Yes. I'm his bodyguard. I want to protect him. What danger can there be in going back to Hurricane? Xiao Yichen didn't think much of it. When Lisa heard this, she immediately said, if I had stayed by Gong Fan's side all the time, this wouldn't have happened. When Xiao Yichen heard this, he was speechless. He didn't want Lisa to go back with Gong Fan. After all, Gong Fan was now a dangerous person. If Lisa did not leave his side at all, she might be in danger. Lisa and Yun Shishir were the same. They were absolutely close to Yu Yu and Gong Fan. They even trusted them blindly. But the more they had such an attitude, the more dangerous it was. Lisa turned her head and looked deeply at Xiao Yichen. So, are you suspecting that Gong Fan is behind this? Xiao Yichen froze for a moment. The hesitation in his eyes infuriated Lisa. Bastard! Her face was ashen as she clenched her fists and punched him in the face. He's your younger brother. It's fine if others don't believe him, but you can't not believe him. How dare you suspect your own brother, Xiao Yichen? You've gone too far. Xiao Yichen took a few steps back and touched his cheek gently. However, his face turned pale when he heard Lisa's words. He was silently regretting that he had spoken too harshly to Gong Fan. Now that Lisa's words were like pearls, he regretted it even more. I'm sorry, you don't have to apologize to me. You should be apologizing to Gong Fan. As Lisa spoke, she walked to Gong Fan's side and grabbed his hand. Let's go. Before Gong Fan could understand what was going on, he was led away by Lisa. Gong Fan was confused and asked, What are you doing? I'm going back to Hurricane with you. Gong Fan sighed and said, You're too rash. This has nothing to do with him. Chapter 4302. I'll go with you. No matter what, I have to protect your safety. Although Yu Yu had told her that they didn't have to address each other as master and servant from now on, in Lisa's heart, if Gong Fan and Yu Yu's lives were in danger, she would definitely sacrifice her life. When Gong Fan heard this, he was unwilling. You don't have to go back with me. You can just stay here. Lisa said firmly, I want to go back with you. No matter what, from now on, I will never leave your side. For some reason, Xiao Yichen, who was standing at the side, felt a little upset when he heard this. He said to Gong Fan, If she wants to go back with you, then let her guard you. Otherwise, she won't be at ease even if she stays here. When Gong Fan heard this, he couldn't refute, so he nodded lightly. Huashan Airport. Hurricane's private jet was already parked on the tarmac. Gong Jie had already arrived with Gong Fan and Lisa. Originally, Mu Yaja also wanted to come, but Gong Jie asked him to stay in the hospital to guard Yun Shishir. If he really couldn't bear to part with Yun Shishir, they could fly to Hurricane together to visit her after Yun Shishir recovered. Only then did Mu Yaja agree. Before leaving, he pulled Gong Fan to the side and squatted in front of him. He asked with some heartache, Will you hate Daddy? Gong Fan was puzzled and tilted his head slightly. Why should I hate you? Because you don't trust me? Because you want me to be brought back to Hurricane? Daddy, Gong Fan hugged him gently. Mu Yaja was a little surprised. It was extremely rare for Gong Fan to take the initiative to hug him. There's something I've never said to you. As Gong Fan spoke, his gaze was a little lonely. He didn't know if he would have the chance to say it after this farewell. Therefore, he had to take this last chance to confess to him. Daddy, I love you. When Mu Yaja heard this, his heart was filled with emotions. He could not help but hug Gong Fan tightly, unwilling to let go for a long time. At the same time, Hua Jin brought Natalia to the airport and successfully met up with Gong Jie. Seeing Gong Jie, Hua Jin was a little suspicious. Are you coming back to Hurricane with us? What is it? Gong Jie raised his eyebrows. Do you have any objections? Can I have an opinion? Do you dare to object? I wouldn't dare. But Gong Jie said, without me, the plane can't directly park at Hurricane's private tarmac. Isn't Alice here? Only Gong Xiaoying and I have the right to land on Hurricane's private tarmac. When Hua Jin heard this, he had nothing else to say. The group boarded the plane successfully. Soon, the flight route was approved. The plane took off on time. On the plane, Lisa sat next to Gong Fan. Before boarding the plane, Alice secretly handed her a pair of handcuffs and told her to take action immediately if she found anything wrong with Gong Fan. Lisa did not understand at first, but Alice said seriously, "Now, I suspect that there might be another personality in Gong Fan's body. This personality is not Gong Fan, nor is it you. It's definitely a dangerous personality. Since you're going back with him, you have to be vigilant at all times. You can't sleep on the plane until we land. You have to watch over him, understand?" Understood. Chapter 4303. I got it. Don't worry, I'll be vigilant at all times. It was a full 10 hours from the capital to Hurricane's flight. And in these 10 hours, no matter how tired Lisa was, she couldn't fall asleep. Alice and Gong Jie went to the restaurant to drink a bottle of dry red wine. Gong Jie was fine, but Alice was tipsy after drinking a few glasses of dry red wine. "I'm going to sleep for a while. What about you?" "You go and rest first. I'll stay here. I'm worried that Lisa can't handle Gong Fan alone." In his seat, Gong Fan drank a glass of fruit juice. He held his head and stared out of the window in a daze. A private jet was different from ordinary civil aviation. It was very spacious. The plane was very big to begin with, and the internal structure was extremely luxurious. The layout was divided into a dining room, a guest room, a living room, and a movie theater. Alice returned to the living room, while Gong Jie, Gong Fan, and Lisa sat in the guest room. The guest room had a solid wood wine cabinet and a small bar counter. Under their feet was an expensive Saxon carpet and an expensive sofa. One look and one could tell that it was expensive. Lisa saw that Gong Fan was staring out of the window in a daze and said carefully, "Aren't you sleepy? If you feel tired, you can sleep for a while." "I don't want to sleep." "Why don't you want to sleep?" "I feel that you're very tired." Gong Fan finally turned to look at her. "I don't dare to sleep." "Why?" "I'm afraid that if I fall asleep, I won't be able to wake up again." Lisa smiled and said helplessly, "Why do you think so? No matter what, don't be so negative about things. Everything will be fine when we return to Hurricane." "How can I believe that everything will be fine just because we're back in Hurricane?" As Gong Fan said this, he lowered his head and looked at his hands numbly. "Even I can't control my own body. How can I believe that others can control me?" Lisa was stunned and suddenly was speechless. She was silent for a long time before she said seriously, "Although that's true, I believe that everything will be fine." "I hope so." Alice walked out of the living room and saw Lisa and Gong Jie sitting together. She suddenly walked over to Gong Jie and asked quietly, "Why do I feel that Lisa is especially important to Gong Fan?" Gong Jie glanced at her coldly and asked suspiciously, "What are you trying to say?" "I'm just asking you if you feel that way." "Yes." "Then, do you still feel that Xiao Yichen cares a lot about Lisa?" Gong Jie immediately understood what she was gossiping about. Hasn't Xiao Yichen always been interested in Lisa? Look, Xiao Yichen likes Lisa, but Lisa likes Yu. No, Gongfei. No matter how I look at it, it looks like a love triangle. Alice said worriedly, "Looking at it this way, when they grow up, will it develop into a love triangle?" Gong Jie smiled. "Then you definitely can't tell that Yu cares a lot about Natalia." "Ah, I can tell." Back then, when Yu insisted that Gong Jie adopt Natalia, she saw through the secret behind it. "Why do you think Yu cares so much about Natalia?" "Because she's pretty." Gong Jie thought about it and could only think of this possibility. "I've lost all hope in this world that only cares about looks." "Then you should have lost hope long ago." Chapter 4304. In this world, one's looks were everything. In this world, one's looks were everything. One's looks were absolute justice. Alice began to count on her fingers again. "You said that Xiao Yichen likes you?" "Oh no, he likes Lisa." "This Lisa likes you?" "That's not right either. She likes Gong Fan." "Anyway, she likes Yu and Gong Fan." "This Yu likes Natalia." "Anyway, the relationship between these children is really hard to cut." Gong Jie glanced at her meaningfully. Alice was still slow to realize. "Why are you looking at me like that?" "It's true that it's hard to cut. If you haven't learned Chinese literature well, don't show off so casually." Alice, also, the corners of Gong Jie's lips twitched as he smiled helplessly. Why are you more worried than their biological mother? This is called treating them as one's own. Alice said seriously, although I'm not their biological mother, doesn't this mean that I'm completely treating them as my own? She looked as if it was natural for her to treat these 4 clowns as her biological children. She looked like a proud mother. Even Gong Jie could not help but laugh when he heard this. Then you're really productive. Productive? What's that? Alice was still a little confused. It was only when she saw Gong Jie's teasing gaze that she understood. Who are you calling an old sow? I'm not talking about you. It's someone who can't wait to take the blame. You? Alice clenched her fists in anger and glared at Gong Jie. All right, I was wrong. It was rare for him to admit his mistake, so Alice did not want to stoop to his level. She smiled and said, don't look down on kids these days. They start to fall in love at a young age, but I don't think this is puppy love. Actually, in ancient China, Xiao Yichen and Yu would have married and had children when they were older. Gong Jie, however, disagreed. I think you guys are overcomplicating the relationship between children. Gong Jie flicked his head. All right, don't worry so much. Aren't you sleepy? Go to bed early. When I wake up, I'll be at my destination. Oh, what about you? Don't you want to rest? I'm worried unless I'm really tired. Alice disagreed. What are you worried about? Lisa will take good care of Gong Fan. If anything happens, I'll ask her to inform me immediately. You don't have to worry too much. You should rest early too. But Gong Jie agreed verbally. However, when Alice returned to the room, he was still sitting in his seat, deep in thought. He did not know what he was thinking, but his mind was a mess. It was as if it was filled with thoughts, but he did not know what he was thinking about. He only felt that his head was very heavy, and he did not know what exactly he was thinking about. He was just inexplicably anxious. He did not know what exactly he was anxious about. Gong Jie poured himself a glass of red wine in frustration and leaned lazily on the sofa. Gong Fan finally could not hold on any longer. He leaned on the sofa and unknowingly closed his eyes gently. Chapter 43:05. Lisa saw that he finally couldn't resist his sleepiness and fell asleep, so she took a blanket from the side and gently covered him with it. At this moment, Alice happened to walk over. Seeing that Gong Fan had fallen asleep, she turned to look at Lisa and asked with concern, "Are you sleepy?" "I'm not sleepy." "You still say you're not sleepy. I think you look a little sleepy." Lisa smiled. "No matter how sleepy I am, I'll guard him. Don't worry. I'm not worried about that. I'm afraid that you'll be too tired. But there's no other way. Because this is a special period, only you can control him." After a pause, Alice said with heartache, "It's been hard on you, Lisa." Lisa shook her head. "It's not hard at all. I'm the one who volunteered to stay by his side, take care of him, and protect him. Why would I feel that it's hard?" "All right," Alice said again. "How about I make you a cup of coffee?" Lisa nodded. After a while, Alice brought a cup of coffee over. Lisa took a sip. Even though she felt that it was bitter, she forced herself to drink it. At night, the lights in the cabin were switched off, leaving only a wall lamp lit in the living room. Gong Fan was lying on the sofa, sleeping soundly with the blanket wrapped around him. Lisa sat at the side. She just sat there, but she was bored to death. The 10-hour flight was very boring and long. But she had to be vigilant at all times and not be negligent. Gong Fan was a dangerous person. Without a doubt, Alice suspected that there was another dangerous personality residing in his body. She believed it. After all, she was unwilling to believe that the real Gong Fan and Yu would be so heartless as to kill Yun Shishir at all costs. As for what kind of physical condition it was, everything would have to wait until they returned to Hurricane before they could come to a conclusion. Alice felt that this matter was very tricky. It was because of Yu and Gong Fan that she braced herself and decided to study this field. Otherwise, she wouldn't have bothered to pay attention to the field of multiple personality disorder. The world of dual personality and multiple personality disorder was full of unimaginable fantasy. Even so, she didn't seem to be very interested. However, because it was Yu, be it for Yun Shishir or Gong Jie, he had to be more careful. Alice went back to her room. She first contacted several colleagues in the psychiatry department of the medical center before going to sleep. At the same time, in the hospital, Yun Shirshir woke up after the effects of the medicine wore off. As soon as she woke up, Xiao Yichen, who had been guarding her, immediately stood up nervously. "Mommy, you're awake?" He walked up to her worriedly and carefully held her hand. He tried to sound as calm as possible. "How is it? Does the wound still hurt? Where's Yu?" Her first sentence was very difficult, but she still managed to squeeze out a few vague syllables. After the painkiller pump's effects wore off, the wound started to hurt faintly. However, she gritted her teeth and endured it. Xiao Yichen's expression froze when he heard this. "Where's Gong Fan?" Yun Shirshir looked troubled and uneasy as Xiao Yichen looked uneasy. "Where is he?" As she said this, she tried to sit up on the bed. When she moved just now, her wound was affected and she grimaced in pain. Chapter 4306. As he spoke, he glanced at the fruits by the bed and asked with a smile, "Do you want to eat something? Are you hungry?" "Where's Gong Fan?" Yun Shirshir repeated stubbornly. Xiao Yichen's expression finally froze. He held his forehead dejectedly. "Mommy, where is he?" Yun Shirshir's tone finally became anxious when she couldn't see Gong Fan. "Answer me." "Mommy, calm down. You're injured now and your wound has just been stitched up. Don't get agitated. Lie down first." Yun Shirshir's chest heaved slightly. She was a little anxious, but she was worried about Xiao Yichen's emotions. She suppressed her agitation and kept asking, "Where is Gong Fan?" Why aren't you answering me? I just want to know where he is. Why are you here watching over me but not seeing him? Where did he go? Did something happen?" When Xiao Yichen heard this, he felt very upset. He understood that in Yun Shirshir's heart, perhaps because she had depended on Yu for such a long time, so her feelings for Yu were stronger than his. He knew that Yun Shirshir favored Yu, but he also understood. After all, humans were not saints. A bowl of water would never be filled. He understood Yun Shirshir's preference for Yu, but sometimes he also felt a little disappointed and sad. Xiao Yichen said desolately, "Isn't it good for me to watch over you? I watched over you for an entire night. When you woke up, you didn't even see who I was, but the first names you called were Gong Fan and Yu. Do you not want me to watch over you?" His tone was desolate and lonely. Yun Shirshir was secretly shocked. At the same time, she realized that her tone and expression had made Xiao Yichen feel a little lonely. "I'm sorry, Xiao Yichen." Yun Shirshir grabbed his hand sadly. "I'm sorry. I was just too worried. After all, you know Yu's condition. I'm too worried about him. Sometimes I really wish I was Yu. Even though I'm not in good health, at least, I can get more of your attention." Xiao Yichen couldn't help but give up on himself. Yun Shirshir immediately scoffed, "Don't spout nonsense. You're in such good health. Yu is so envious of you. You're not allowed to say such things in the future." "Because I'm jealous." Little Yichen suddenly blurted this out. He looked up at Yun Shirshir and took a deep breath. "I envy him. No matter what, you always prioritize his feelings and take care of him. Although I don't covet such a privilege, I don't envy it. It's not real." He was envious, but because he was the older brother, he tolerated it. He yearned for it, but because Yu was the younger brother, he gave in. Yun Shirshir liked him. She liked how sensible he was. Hence, he wanted to be more sensible. He worked hard. But, in the end, he still couldn't compare to Yu. He didn't say that he wanted to compete with Yu. Instead, he hoped, if he could get more attention, even if it was just a little bit, he wouldn't be greedy. Yun Shirshir looked at Xiao Yichen's desolate expression and felt as though a knife was being twisted in her heart. "I'm sorry. I know it's unfair to you. She didn't think that this would hurt Xiao Yichen's feelings. This wasn't what she wanted. Chapter 4307. When Mu Yaja heard from the nurse that Yun Shirshir had woken up, he hurried over. However, when he reached the door of the ward, he sensed that the atmosphere in the room was extremely tense. He immediately sensed that something was wrong. Yun Shirshir was lying on the bed with reddened eyes. Xiao Yichen was sitting quietly beside her. He did not leave her side, but he clearly looked a little lonely. What's wrong? Little Ichen, on the other hand, buried his head even lower. He lowered his head on purpose. His fringe covered his slightly reddened eyes so that Mu Yaja would not see it. However, even though he did not want Mu Yaja to see it, Mu Yaja could imagine the expression on his son's face. Even though he did not know what had happened, this was the first time he had seen Xiao Yichen look so lonely. Mu Yaja walked slowly to his son's side and gently patted him on the shoulder. The communication between father and son was often this simple. There was no need for words. He was silent, but it gave him a lot of strength. Xiao Yichen forced his tears back and looked up to meet his father's eyes. "Daddy, you must be tired." Mu Yaja looked at his son's tired face and said, "You stayed by mommy's side all night. It must have been hard on you." "No, it wasn't hard. Mommy is awake now. You should go back and rest. But don't tire yourself out. You're still growing. Don't stay up for too long." When Xiao Yichen heard this, he stood up. However, his body was swaying and he looked a little dazed. When Yun Shishir saw this, she was annoyed and heartbroken. She wanted to say something, but in the end, she did not say anything. Xiao Yichen left the ward, gently closed the door behind him, and left without a sound. Mu Yaja sat down on his seat and gently held her hand. His tone was gentle as he asked, "You're awake?" Yun Shishir lowered her head in vexation, looking like a child who had made a mistake. Mu Yaja pursed his lips and roughly guessed what had happened just now. This man was so shrewd. Just by looking at the silent expression between the two people, he could figure out their psychological state. Instead of going straight to the point, he changed the topic. "I remember when we went to the pet shop, you saw a room with a closed door. You were curious and asked why the door wasn't open. What did the owner say? Do you still remember?" Yun Shishir was a little stunned. She didn't know why Mu Yaja said that, but seeing his serious expression, she didn't question him. She thought for a while and said, "I remember that the shop owner said that a bitch gave birth to a puppy, so it's inconvenient for her to see strangers." "Then, do you know why it's inconvenient for a female dog to see a puppy after giving birth to one?" Yun Shishir was at a loss and shook her head. "That's because once a female dog comes into contact with a living person's aura, it will be frightened. When it's frightened, it will eat the puppy." Hiss! She sucked in a breath of cold air. How could they be so cruel? Mu Yaja's lips curled into a smile as he slowly explained, "That's because a female dog will be very weak after giving birth. In addition, the female dogs in pet shops are all locked in cages. Once they come into contact with something they perceive as dangerous, they will realize that they and the puppy have nowhere to run. Hence, out of maternal instinct and protective instinct, they will eat the puppy." "How is that possible? Don't you think that's too far-fetched? Even a vicious tiger won't eat its cubs." Chapter 4308. Mu Yaja looked at her deeply. There were too many complicated emotions in his gaze. Because, as the saying goes, caring makes one confused. Motherhood is great, but sometimes, it is also blind. When Yun Shishir heard this, she was stunned. She finally understood the meaning behind Mu Yaja's words. The reason why he said this to her was probably because he also noticed that she was too concerned about Yu, so much so that she had become blind. She had even neglected Xiao Yichen for a while. It might be difficult to achieve an absolute balance between the relationship between mother and son. However, she also realized that she seemed to be too biased. Yun Shishir sighed and said sadly, "I understand what you're trying to say. Actually, the female dog cares about the puppy and protects the puppy. However, because she thinks that she is protecting the puppy, she eats the puppy. As a result, the puppy doesn't even have the chance to open his eyes and see the world clearly." Mu Yaja raised his eyebrows but did not say anything. Yun Shishir said helplessly, "Yu has been in poor health since he was young. I always felt that this was my fault. I always regretted it." Mu Yaja was puzzled. "What are you regretting?" "I always regret that if I didn't keep him by my side out of selfishness, perhaps his health wouldn't be so poor. So, you want to make up for what you think is your fault?" Yun Shishir nodded guiltily. "Then, aren't you also wrong for treating Xiao Yichen?" Yun Shishir was speechless for a moment. "Look, Xiao Yichen stayed by your side the whole night. When you woke up, you were in a hurry to find Yu and ignored his concern. Yun Shishir was shocked. You saw it just now? No. Then why did you? I judged it from his expression and yours. Yun Shishir was shocked. She did not expect this man to be so observant and sensitive. She became more and more annoyed. Did Xiao Yichen really watch over me all night? More than one night, right? I also asked him to rest, but he wasn't willing. He said that he had to guard you. When Yun Shishir heard this, her heart ached even more. She felt suffocated when she imagined Xiao Yichen's desolate gaze. Actually, regardless of what happened, even if you did not keep Yu by your side and even if I brought Yu back to the Mu family, even if he received the best treatment in the world, he may not have received so much love. If he wasn't there to tie us down, we might not have been able to meet again. Since it had already happened, going back to the past, even if there was a single mistake, the trajectory of life would fall like dominoes. I think that no matter who it is, no one is willing to go back and start over. When Yun Shishir heard this, she did not say anything. Mu Yaja knew that she must be feeling sad. She also realized that she was too harsh on Xiao Yichen in this aspect. Hence, she looked like she was about to break down. Mu Yaja did not mention Xiao Yichen. Instead, he asked indirectly, "Do you remember what happened before?" Yun Shishir was obviously stunned. She looked up and stared blankly at Mu Yaja. Her lips were obviously trembling. Do you still remember? Chapter 4309. I don't remember. Do you really not remember, or are you faking it? Mu Yaja raised his eyebrows and said, I'm your husband. What else do you have to hide from me? I'm afraid. What are you afraid of? Mu Yaja didn't think much of it. What are you afraid of? Could it be that Yun Shishir was worried that he would find out the truth and hate Yu and Gong Fan? Yun Shishir lowered her head and sighed helplessly. I'm afraid that it's real. I don't want to believe that it's real. I've been lying to myself. It's fake. It's my hallucination, Shishir. Mu Yaja pulled her into his arms, his heart aching. Since it's already happened, what's the point of lying to yourself? Yun Shishir recalled the scene before she fainted and sucked in a deep breath of cold air. In the end, she could not stop her tears from rolling down her cheeks. They were connected by flesh and blood. She had been stabbed by her own child. Until now, Yun Shishir couldn't believe it when she recalled the hideous expression on that innocent and adorable face. She was in so much pain. That's not real, Yun Shishir choked and said, I don't believe it. That's Gong Fan. That's you. That's not real. Yes, that's not real. Something must have gone wrong. Mu Yaja stroked her hair gently and comforted her. Don't worry too much, okay? Everything will be fine. That's definitely not Gong Fan. He wouldn't do that. You wouldn't do that either. Okay, I believe you. When Yun Shishir heard his words, she finally heaved a sigh of relief. It was as if a heavy burden had been lifted off her shoulders. Then, can you tell me now what exactly happened? Yun Shishir calmed down a little as she slowly explained the situation. At that time, she only remembered that she was sitting by the bed and cutting an apple for Gong Fan. At that time, Gong Fan was still in a semi-conscious state. The nurse said that Gong Fan would wake up soon. She thought that when he woke up, the apple would be cut. After she finished peeling the apple, Gong Fan woke up. She was ecstatic because the doctor had told her that if Gong Fan woke up, it meant that he was fine. However, her joy did not last long, because she felt that Gong Fan's expression was obviously a little unusual. Usually, even though Gong Fan was very cold to others, no matter when he faced her, his gaze was always extremely gentle. However, things were different now. Cold, indifferent, and expressionless. His eyes even had a hint of icy cold sharpness. Yun Shishir then asked him if he wanted to eat some fruit. Gong Fan followed the direction of her hand and his gaze landed on the fruit knife beside the fruit plate. A layer of scarlet gradually surfaced in his eyes. He suddenly reached out and held the fruit knife tightly. Yun Shishir was shocked. She didn't know what his motive was or why he was holding the knife. However, when she saw him holding the knife so tightly, she didn't know why, but at that time, she faintly felt that there was something wrong with the person in front of her. She started to retreat. Just as she stood up and took half a step back, Gong Fan held the knife and stabbed at her fiercely. Chapter 43:10. Immediately after, the knife was forcefully pulled out. Yun Shirshir clutched her abdomen and fell to the ground in despair. At that time, my entire mind went blank. I couldn't believe that Gong Fan would stab me with his own hands. At that time, the fruit knife that Yun Shirshir used was brought from home and was meticulously made. Otherwise, if Gong Fan had pulled it out like that, the handle and the blade would have broken into two due to the strong suction force from the flesh. At that time, there were two fortunate things. One was that Xiao Yichen rushed over in time. When Gong Fan waved the fruit knife and was about to stab her again, Xiao Yichen stopped him in time. Another fortunate thing was that, although the knife had been pulled out of his body, causing him to bleed profusely, Yun Shirshir was still in the hospital. If this had happened at home or somewhere more than a 30-minute drive away from the hospital, she would definitely have been in a life-threatening situation due to excessive blood loss. Xiao Yichen stopped Gong Fan and hurriedly called for the nurse. Then she fell into a daze due to the blood loss. Because of the intense pain in her abdomen, she didn't dare to move easily. From the beginning to the end, she only maintained one posture. She still remembered the piercing pain caused by the muscles all over her body when she was carried onto the operating table. It was still unforgettable. What happened after that had nothing to do with her. She only remembered waking up once after the operation. However, because the effects of the medicine had just worn off, when she woke up, the nurse happened to be changing her dressing. She only felt that there was a terrifying wound on her abdomen. It had already been stitched up, but the wound was extremely hideous. The stitched area was red and swollen, and there was yellow medicine applied on it. It was a stark contrast to the rest of her fair skin. She called out Yu, but her lips and teeth were blurry. The nurse thought that she was crying out in pain and gave her an analgesic pump. Then she fell asleep again in a daze. "Where's Gong Fan?" Yun Shirshir looked at Mu Yaja worriedly. "Where is he now?" Mu Yaja didn't say anything for a moment. When Yun Shirshir saw this, she couldn't help but tremble in fear. "You didn't lock him up, did you?" In fact, if Mu Yaja really locked him up, Yun Shirshir would not be surprised. After all, to everyone, Gong Fan was now a dangerous person. Mu Yaja said, "I didn't lock him up." "Where is he?" Mu Yaja said calmly, "I've already asked Alice to take him back to Hurricane." "Well, what?" Yun Shirshir's heart jumped again. Mu Yaja knew that she was a little agitated when she heard this, so he held her shoulders and said seriously, "Now, you have to admit that Yu is sick and Gong Fan's existence is Yu's suffering. Didn't you say before that you were determined to give up Gong Fan for Yu? Although this decision may be a little cruel, but do you really have the heart to destroy Yu's life for your selfishness?" Yun Shirshir couldn't help but widen her eyes. Do you really have the heart to do that?" Mu Yaja's eyes were slightly red. It was obvious that he had used up all his willpower to make this decision. Chapter 43:11. Just hearing this word made Yun Shirshir feel extremely depressed. She pursed her lips tightly and her whole body began to tremble. She didn't dare to blink, afraid that if she blinked, her tears would fall. However, no matter how wide her eyes were, tears continued to fall from her eyes and dripped onto the white blanket. "I'm sorry." Yun Shirshir's voice was extremely hoarse. "All this time, I've been like a spoiled child. Whether it was you, Xiao Jie, Hua Jin, Yu, Xiao Yichen, Gong Fan, no matter who it was, they all doted on me like I was a princess. I've been spoiled, and I've become more and more willful. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have been so selfish. For my own thoughts, I became Yu's shackles. I'm sorry." She had apologized countless times, but when she said this, it really meant that she had no choice but to let go. No matter how unwilling she was, she had to let go. All this time, she had been doted on by everyone. She was deeply grateful that she had a husband named Mu Yaja, a pair of adorable twins named Xiao Yichen and Yu, a cute daughter named Yueyao, and two younger brothers named Gong Jie and Hua Jin. Everyone doted on her at all costs. She had been too arrogant because she had been pampered too much. She had wanted too much. She had asked for too much. However, what she wanted did not belong to her at all. She couldn't bear such a price. It was all Yu Yu's fault. When she thought of Yu Yu, her heart ached fiercely again. I'm sorry. Yun Shirshir was so upset that she cried loudly. Mu Yaja hugged her, his heart aching. Don't cry. This isn't your fault. Yun Shirshir couldn't stop crying. Even now, the wound had not been completely stitched up. Every time she cried, it would affect the wound, but she could not control it at all. Mu Yaja's heart ached, but there was nothing he could do for her. He could only kiss her silently and hug her. Unknowingly, his eyes were also wet. Outside the ward, Xiao Yichen leaned against the door and covered his mouth. His eyes were unbelievably red. Mommy! In the cabin, amidst the incomparable silence, Gong Fan's body suddenly curled up. His hands grabbed his chest, and his entire body trembled from the pain. Even though his voice was very soft, Lisa, who was resting at the side, was immediately awakened. She turned her head and saw Gong Fan curled up into a ball on the sofa. She rushed over nervously. What happened? Mommy? Lisa was extremely worried. She gently patted his face, thinking that he was having a nightmare, and shook him. Gong Fan, wake up. Are you dreaming? Gong Fan? Gong Fan was finally awakened by her shaking. He lifted his heavy eyelids with difficulty and opened his eyes. His vision was blurry, but he saw Lisa's hazy face. Lisa sized him up nervously. What's wrong? Did you have a nightmare? Gong Fan sat up from the sofa with his hand on his chest. He still had lingering fears. My chest hurts. Hurts? Why would it hurt? As soon as he finished speaking, Lisa saw Gong Fan's breathing suddenly quicken. Respiratory syndrome. Chapter 43:12. Now that he had suddenly relapsed, Lisa was at a loss. How did this happen? Gong Fan leaned against the sofa and curled up. His breathing became more rapid and his shoulders trembled violently. Lisa's heart ached, but she didn't know what to do. What should we do? Lisa immediately rummaged through the cabinets and started looking for the paper bag. Gong Fan had used up all his energy just to maintain the balance of his breathing. Lisa couldn't find the paper bag no matter how hard she searched. However, she was still calm. She rushed to Alice's room and knocked hard on the door. Alice, Gong Fan is having a relapse. Wake up. Alice wasn't in a deep sleep. She was woken up and rushed out of the room. Just as she reached the door, she heard rapid breathing coming from the sofa. She immediately realized that something was wrong. She turned around and returned to the room. She immediately took out the paper bag from her bag. Because of Gong Fan's health, the paper bag was always prepared. Although Yu Yu's health was already very stable, Alice still prepared these necessities just in case. She took the paper bag and walked to Gong Fan's side. She stuffed the paper bag into his hand. Grab him. Do you know the method I taught you? Gong Fan trembled as he grabbed the paper bag and aimed the mouth of the bag at his nose. I've had respiratory syndrome. The patient would breathe faster and shallower due to excessive anxiety, pain, fever, crying, and other situations, causing respiratory alkalosis, which was hypocapnia caused by excessive carbon dioxide excretion. It could be shown as dizziness, numbness in the hands and feet, and around the mouth. By using the paper bag, it formed a dead space for the respiratory tract, which helped to restore the concentration of carbon dioxide. This was a simple and effective method. With Alice's help, Gong Fan used the paper bag and tried his best to adjust his breathing. Take a deep breath. Gong Fan took a deep breath. The paper bag shrank rapidly as the air flowed out. Breathe, exhale. Gong Fan slowly exhaled the turbid air from his mouth and nose. His rapid breathing gradually cooled down. Gong Fan tightened his mouth and his breathing became slower and slower. Alice heaved a sigh of relief. Lisa asked with a strange expression, why did he suddenly fall ill again? I thought that he had completely recovered from his respiratory syndrome. This kind of illness is mostly caused by mental and psychological problems. In addition, his lungs and heart aren't as healthy as ordinary people, so it's easy for him to relapse. It can be triggered by any reason, and there is no such thing as complete recovery. Lisa nodded as if she understood. Then, you must be more careful in the future. It's better to have these things ready at all times. What would happen if there was no paper bag? Alice raised her eyebrows and replied, "Didn't I say before that if it's serious, it might cause shock?" Lisa shuddered. It was no wonder that Yun Shirshir would always carry a few paper bags with her at all times, even if she didn't carry any cosmetics or makeup powder in her bag. So this was the reason. She even felt that Yun Shirshir was too cautious. Little did she know that Yun Shirshir's concern for Gong Fan was meticulous and meticulous. Chapter 43:13. Gong Fan, how do you feel? Are you feeling better? Gong Fan nodded and pursed his lips. I'm fine. Alice held his wrist and turned it up to check his pulse. His heart rate was still at a relatively fast level. What's going on? Alice also felt that it was a little strange. Although it could be triggered by anything, this relapse was too sudden. Even he was a little caught off guard. Gong Fan calmed down and shook his head. I don't know why either. It's just that I feel my heart palpitate for no reason. While I'm half awake, subconsciously, my breathing suddenly quickened. Did you have a nightmare? Gong Fan was startled and was a little suspicious. How did you know? Why would I feel my heart palpitate for no reason? Gong Fan lowered his eyes in desolation. He leaned against the sofa dejectedly and said sadly, Am I a burden to you? Alice was stunned. Humans were all afraid of death. No matter who it was, they would always be filled with fear at the moment before death. Even someone as strong as Gong Fan would fear death one day. To the alternate personality, the day it was exiled was the day it completely disappeared. Alice took a deep breath. I will protect you. But why do I exist as such a life form? Gong Fan sighed in his heart. Humans were really a mysterious and complicated existence. When Lisa heard this, she couldn't take it anymore. She said nervously, Is there really no other way? There are two personalities. Do we have to get rid of one? Yu, isn't Yu also willing to accept Gong Fan? Why are the two personalities conflicting with each other? Alice frowned and was a little hesitant. Lisa continued, Now, Yu and Gong Fan's personalities are clearly getting along harmoniously. They can get along harmoniously. They have the habit of keeping diaries. No matter what happens today, they will record it in their diaries. No matter who woke up that day, they would be able to understand what had happened that day through the diary. Wasn't that a good thing? Why must you make such a cruel decision? Alice sighed. There's one thing I might have forgotten to mention. What? Dual personality disorder and multiple personality disorder don't actually have much of a boundary. Let me give you an example. In Yu's world, there are two palaces. Only the main personality lives in one palace, and no one knows how many personalities live in the other palace. Do you understand? Lisa didn't quite understand. She didn't say anything and continued to listen to her. Alice continued, Now, because of Gong Fan's existence, the door has been opened. Then, because of his existence, won't this open door never be closed? Since the door is open, other personalities will come out one after another. Sometimes, these personalities won't come out at all. Sometimes, these personalities will swarm out. When Lisa heard this, she could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. Chapter 43:14. Lisa frowned and suggested an idea. If that's the case, what if Yu and Gong Fan work together to close this door? Then, Gong Fan and Yu could live in the same palace. Wouldn't that work? Alice pondered and said, I suspect that Gong Fan used to live in Yu's palace. Hence, the two personalities merged together and there was no obvious difference. This kind of illness was too complicated. A person's mental illness was far more difficult to control than a physical illness. A person's physical illness could be seen and could be cured through surgery. However, mental illness could not be cured. Hence, in the field of mental illness, hypnosis was definitely the best treatment method. Then, the problem is how to close this door. Alice stood up and glanced at Gong Fan. She said hesitantly, Do you know what I suspect the most now? What? I suspect that Professor Romanka created Natalia's second personality through hypnosis. Then he sent Natalia to Yu's side and the second Natalia, through hypnosis, created a third personality in Yu to complete the purpose of his experiment. Lisa was suspicious. Does Romanka know about Yu's illness? Yes. Alice said, I consulted him about Yu's illness before. He was very interested and suggested that he wanted to do the experiment on Yu. I did not agree. You mean, Lisa quickly understood what Alice was trying to say. Actually, Romanka deliberately sent Natalia to Yu's side so that it would be easier for him to carry out his plan? Rather than calling it a plan, it was better to call it a conspiracy. That's what I suspect. Gong Fan was silent. Just thinking about it in detail was enough to make one terrified. Indeed, after experiencing Natalia's hypnosis, his body had undergone earth-shaking changes. Then, what should we do now? When we return to Hurricane, I will invite Romanka over. Lisa was surprised. Isn't that the same as letting a wolf into the house? How could that be? If a hurricane comes, then it's my territory. What kind of storm can he stir up? When Lisa heard this, she was still a little worried. Professor Romanka always gives me the feeling that he is a cunning old man. He was once an authority in psychology and a senior professor of multiple personality disorder. When I interacted with him before, I had to be careful when I spoke to him. Gong Jie passed through a grill and entered another part of the cabin. The entire private jet was divided into 2 cabins. The other cabin had the same structure as the main airport he was in. By then, Hua Jin had already put Natalia to sleep. Hua Jin, on the other hand, had drunk some coffee in the afternoon, so he wasn't sleepy and was drinking tea in the living room. When Gong Jie walked in just now, he caught a glimpse of Gong Jie from the corner of his eye and immediately felt nervous. Why you here? Can't I be here? Gong Jie sat up on the sofa and crossed his legs elegantly. Hua Jin looked even more uneasy. He put down the teacup and looked at Meng Chao. It's so late. Aren't you sleeping? I can't sleep. Chapter 43:15. Hua Jin stood up, poured a cup of brewed tea, and handed it to him. Gong Fan took it and asked curiously, What tea is this? I don't know. I only saw this box on the wine cabinet. Da Hong Pao. Gong Jia only remembered that there were Da Hong Pao and Taiping Hokue on the plane. That was to be used when receiving VIPs. Da Hong Pao? When Hua Jin heard this, he was very curious. Is this real Da Hong Pao or fake Da Hong Pao? The reason why he asked this was not because he doubted Gong Jia, but because Da Hong Pao was really a noble tea. It was extremely rare. Da Hong Pao was produced in Fujian's Wui Mountain. It was an oolong tea of excellent quality. It was a special tea in China. There were very few Da Hong Pao in history, and the only Da Hong Pao that was recognized were the few on the walls of the Nine Dragons' Nest. Because the Da Hong Pao tea trees grew on cliffs where no one could climb, the monks of the temple would use fruits as bait to train monkeys to pick the tea leaves. Therefore, some people called it monkey-picking tea. It was also because of this that the production was very low. The Da Hong Pao tea trees were 10 feet tall, and the leaves were as big as palms. They grew on cliffs, and when the wind blew, the leaves fell. The monks of the temple collected them to make tea, which could cure all kinds of diseases. At its best, the production of tea leaves was only a few hundred grams. A few hundred grams was less than a caddy. Most of them were supplied internally by people in positions of power, and the Da Hong Pao on the market was not considered pure Da Hong Pao. No wonder he only saw a little of it. He thought that it was the residue of Gong Jie drinking it, so he soaked it all. No wonder the smell was so strong. When he thought of this, Hua Jin suddenly felt uneasy. Da Hong Pao was so rare. God, it was Da Hong Pao. If it was the real deal, then wouldn't he be wasting God's gift recklessly? Do you think I would drink fake tea leaves? No. Dozens of grams of tea leaves were all brewed by him. Rounding it up, he felt as if he had drunk 100 million yuan. It's too strong. Gong Jie muttered and asked casually, Don't tell me you soaked all of it? Hua Jin blushed with guilt. He replied awkwardly. I thought it was just ordinary tea leaves. Gong Jie's face darkened. You think my tea leaves are ordinary? No, that's not what I meant. Hua Jin lowered his head and said guiltily, At most, I'll compensate you. I bought these tea leaves from an auction. 50 grams, 5 million. You'll pay for it? Hua Jin's breath was stuck in his throat, making it even more difficult for him to breathe. However, he didn't want Gong Jie to look down on him. He braced himself and said, "I'll pay for it. It's not like I can't afford it." After being in the entertainment industry for so many years, it wouldn't be right to say that he didn't have any family background. Although 5 million wasn't a sky-high price, 5 million for just a few dozen grams of tea leaves really made his heart, liver, spleen, lungs, and kidneys ache. Hua Jin bargained, 5 million. I'll pay you 2. 5 million. Why is it 2? 5 million? Gong Jie didn't understand. Hua Jin pursed his lips and glanced at the teacup in Gong Jie's hand. Didn't you drink it too? The drinker gets a share. Is that how you calculate it? Gong Jie said unhappily, "You've soaked such good tea leaves in one go. The essence is gone, and you still have the nerve to say that the drinker gets a share?" Hua Jin felt even more guilty. He muttered to himself, but he couldn't hear what he was muttering. How painful! Chapter 43:16. When Gong Jie saw him sitting on pins and needles, he suddenly found it funny. The anger in his heart was also swept away. Hua Jin felt very uneasy. He actually drank such precious tea in one go. He suddenly felt a little guilty. When Gong Jie saw this, he snorted. "Forget it, I don't like da hong pao. I like to drink green tea." "Then, what's the tea beside da hong pao?" Hua Jin asked. "Taiping Hokue." "Hokue." Gong Jie raised his eyebrows and glanced at him meaningfully. "But, are you still coveting my Hokue?" No, how would he dare to? Just drinking a pot of da hong pao was enough to make him bankrupt. If he drank another pot of Hokue, wouldn't he be emptied of all his savings? Corrupt, it's really too corrupt. Hua Jin thought to himself. In this world, the gap between the rich and the poor was really too big. Some people were born with a silver spoon in their mouths. When they were born, they were destined to be the cream of the crop. Some people, on the other hand, had lived for most of their lives and did not understand even a little bit of what life was like. 5 million to Gong Jie might be a pot of tea, but to an ordinary family, it might be an income that they would not be able to earn in their lifetime. It's not fair. Hua Jin also felt a little unbalanced. Although his voice was very low, Gong Jie heard it clearly. "What's not fair?" Hua Jin said frankly, "Look, this pot of tea of yours is equivalent to an ordinary family's lifetime savings. In other words, an ordinary person who works hard for a lifetime may not even be able to afford this pot of tea of yours." When Gong Jie heard this, he smiled. "How is it not fair? I think it's very fair." "But that's because we were born different." Gong Jie's tone was not arrogant at all. It was a calm narration that could not be any calmer. When Hua Jin heard this, he did not dare to agree. "How is it fair? If you judge things according to your logic, then everyone's life is very unfair. Some people are born with broken limbs, while others are born healthy and intelligent. Can you say that those who are healthy and intelligent are at fault?" Hua Jin was speechless and finally shook his head silently. In that case, why is it unfair for some people to be born rich while others are born poor and remain poor for their entire lives? Hua Jin was actually unable to come up with an answer to such a change in conditions. In other words, if a person who was born with a disability walks on the road, according to your thinking, you will definitely think that he is the person in the world who was treated the most unfairly by fate. Then I still feel that fate is unfair to me. Why? Hua Jin was a little confused. What else do you think is unfair? You live in a big villa and have your own private jet. To you, money is just a string of numbers in your bank account. You are blessed with good looks and will never know the taste of poverty. You probably can't even understand that some people can't live a stable life, right? You are the elite standing at the top of the pyramid in this world. You will never know how the people at the bottom of the pyramid live. Chapter 43:17. Gong Jie's expression froze when he heard that. His gaze turned cold as it slowly landed on Hua Jin. He gently put down the teacup in his hand. Hua Jin also realized that his words were too extreme. He bit his lips, not knowing how to explain. Gong Jie placed the teacup on the table and smiled. "You're wrong." On the contrary, I've seen more of such deviations than you. Gong Jie looked up and stared at him. In southern Fei, I've seen extravagant aristocrats who drove luxury cars worth millions and lived in mansions worth tens of millions. The slums that were separated from the wealthy district by a street never had a single light on at night. In Felvbin, I've seen children who had just turned 6 years old follow their siblings and jump into dirty gutters. Even if they accidentally choked on a few mouthfuls of dirty water filled with hundreds of millions of bacteria, they would still try their best to scoop up a few plastic bottles to survive. To them, the most extravagant and luxurious meal was the leftovers of ordinary people that were on the verge of rotting. I've also seen refugees living in the flames of war, using their blood as the price to support a bunch of corrupt regimes. Yes, you're right. Fate is very unfair, but this is the true face of fate. It's very funny, but ordinary people don't dare to laugh at it. Hua Jin was stunned. Do you know what fate is? Gong Jie smiled. You can't get what you want, but you don't get what you want. Do you think those rich children are all enjoying life when they're born? Yes, they're enjoying life, but at the same time, they're also enduring it. Enjoying things that ordinary people couldn't even dream of, and enduring things that ordinary people didn't dare to endure. Gong Jie was destined to live an extraordinary life from the moment he was born. After returning to the Gong family, Gong Xiaoying appreciated him and he began to stand out. His extraordinary talent gave him an irreplaceable place in the Gong family. However, with his talent, even if he did not return to the Gong family, he would not be buried. A strong and outstanding seed, if casually thrown into the dust, would quietly break through the soil and bloom into a beautiful flower. Just like Yu. His childhood environment was so ordinary that it could not be any more ordinary. However, Yu was destined to lead an extraordinary life. Fate was such a funny thing. But ordinary people didn't dare to laugh at him. Since you've got it, cherish it. After Gong Jie finished speaking, Hua Jin was still stunned for a long time. He didn't expect Gong Jie to say something so philosophical. Thinking about it, one could understand the meaning behind it. I'm sorry, Hua Jin sighed. I was too extreme. It's not a matter of being extreme or not. The man chuckled. It's just that you can't blame yourself for what you've gotten. Who doesn't have shackles? If that's the case, it's better. Hua Jin could not help but laugh bitterly when he heard that. It's hard to imagine that you're the one who said these words. Gong Jie glanced at him with a hint of self-mockery in his handsome eyes. If possible, I hope that my life will be more ordinary. How ordinary do you want it to be? Gong Jie's life was destined to be extraordinary. Hua Jin held his chin in puzzlement. If a person is too ordinary, it'll be very tiring. How do you imagine an ordinary life to be? It's good to be like you. Chapter 43:18. When Hua Jin heard that, he suddenly laughed. For an ordinary person like me, my life is already very extraordinary. But for young Master Gong, well, I'm indeed very ordinary. I have a stable job, an average-sized house, a car, and an ordinary family. At the very least, I don't want to be too deeply exposed to the cruelty of this world. Gong Jie smiled arrogantly. Even if I'm not Gong Jie, I'm destined to be extraordinary. Perhaps I won't lose to Muyaja. That's not necessarily true. Everything you have now, besides yourself, a part of it is given to you by the Gong family. That's true. Gong Jie sneered. For Muyaja, a part of what he has comes from the Mu family, right? Hua Jin felt awkward. That's true too. I won't lose to him. Gong Jie was obviously not convinced by his brother-in-law, Muyaja. Hua Jin scratched his cheek with his fingers and teased, seems like there's a strong smell of gunpowder in the air. I saw that both of you were getting along so harmoniously that I thought both of you would be able to coexist peacefully. Coexist peacefully? Maybe in our next life. Gong Jie did not buy Muyaja's words at all. If it were not for Yun Shishir, the two of them might have been destined to be enemies for life. Why are we talking about this topic unknowingly? It was only then that Hua Jin came to his senses. It was too exaggerated. Because of a pot of Dahong Pao, they had actually talked for so long. So, Gong Jie cast a sidelong glance at him. When do you intend to give it to me? What? Hua Jin could not help but feel confused by the sudden question. Gong Jie leaned closer to him and said word by word, 5,010,000. Hua Jin put up a defensive posture. You really want me to give it to you? I'm serious. Hua Jin's eyes darted around as he pretended to touch his body. Then he feigned exasperation and said, Look, I don't have much money left on me. Young Master Gong, how about I give myself to you? Pay with your body? You can understand it that way. Gong Jie could not help but laugh. Hua Jin saw him smile, so he held his face with both hands and deliberately raised a charming smile, smiling very sweetly. Anyway, I'm conservatively estimating that I'm worth at least 5 million yuan. How about I give myself to you? When Gong Jie said these two words, Hua Jin looked surprised. Young Master Gong, I couldn't tell that you like men? I'm not interested in men. After a pause, Gong Jie looked at him meaningfully. But I'm very interested in you. Hearing this, Hua Jin's mouth was half open. He could not react for a moment. He was just joking and wanted to fool him with this 5 million yuan. How did he fall into the ditch he had dug? He did not know how to continue this conversation. But, are you regretting it? Hua Jin was speechless for a moment. He stood up awkwardly. Just as he was about to say something, the plane suddenly shook violently. Hua Jin lost his balance and fell onto Gong Jie's body. The plane encountered turbulence, causing it to shake. Gong Jie supported him with one strong arm. Hua Jin grabbed the corner of Gong Jie's shirt tightly to stabilize his center of gravity. Chapter 43:19. After the turbulence passed, Hua Jin lowered his head and tried to stand up, but Gong Jie reached out and pulled him back into his embrace. Hua Jin's face was burning. At the same time, his heart beat even faster because of his sudden action. Gong Jie lowered his head to size him up before asking out of the blue, Are you throwing yourself at me? When did I do that? Hua Jin struggled to get up, but Gong Jie grabbed his arm again with a playful look in his eyes. Playing hard to get? What nonsense was this man talking about? Gong Jie pinched his cheek with one hand. If you make such a joke again in the future and I take it seriously, what should I do? His tone didn't sound like a question, but more like a question. Hua Jin's brain went blank. If I take it seriously, will you take responsibility? Hua Jin. He did not mean that at all. He just wanted to be tactful and did not mean anything else. Gong Jie could not bear to tease him anymore. He stood up and said, If you encounter turbulence, it's not the safest choice to hide in someone's arms. You should return to your seat and fasten your seatbelt. This is the most basic safety measure. With that, under Hua Jin's glare, Gong Jie turned around and left. As soon as Gong Jie left, Hua Jin slammed the table. This man, what kind of nonsense is he saying? Hua Jin took a deep breath and finally calmed down. The 10-hour flight was long and torturous. Hua Jin fell asleep on the sofa. He did not know how long he had slept, but in his daze, he could only hear the rumbling of the turbulence and the ringing in his ears getting worse. He was jolted awake. He got up and looked out of the window, only to see that the plane had already pierced through the clouds and was rapidly descending toward an island. He found it very novel. This island has a very large port. This port is even much larger than the port in Osaka, Japan. There are many cargo ships docked at the port. From his high angle, it seems that he can only see a black mass of ships. Immediately after, as the plane descended rapidly, he saw a magnificent castle on the island. Even from afar, he could see it clearly. That majestic castle was magnificent. Usually, he would only see such castles in Hollywood movies. It was said that this castle had been built for a long time. It had a history of more than a few hundred years. When Gong Xiaoying bought this island, he also bought the land where the castle was located and moved it over. What was that saying? Indeed, one could do whatever one wanted with money. Hua Jin was already in a daze just by looking at her. This was the first time he had set foot on the Gong family's island. However, seeing it with his own eyes was far from what he had imagined. In his imagination, a private island, Hurricane's base, a military base, gunpowder, Hurricane's private island must be heavily guarded and gave off a gloomy feeling. However, The reality was that it was sunny and sunny. The sea was blue. Under the clouds, the true appearance of the castle was gradually revealed. It stood on the top of the island, exuding an inviolable majesty. Hua Jin sighed and widened his eyes. He leaned against the window and stared curiously at the castle, unable to take his eyes off it. Outside the castle, there was heavy security. Chapter 43:20. Hurricane. This was a term that seemed to control the entire world. Now, little by little, it was gradually becoming complete in front of him. After the plane landed, it went through a series of inspections. In Hurricane, almost all private planes returning from overseas, no matter who they were, had to go through a series of sophisticated inspections after landing. Even Gong Jie was no exception. They were worried that someone had tampered with the plane. He still remembered one time when Gong Jie came back from South Africa. After an inspection, he was shocked to find that many high-tech trackers had been secretly planted in his private plane without him knowing. These trackers were the most advanced technology in the world today. Even the 5 government buildings in Country M might not be able to detect them. If it were not for the meticulous inspection, these trackers would not have been discovered at all. Later, the plane was almost forced to be scrapped because no one could be sure if these trackers were still in the body of the plane. No one knew when these trackers had been planted. Since then, the landing inspection became more and more stringent. This time, the landing inspection took more than half an hour. When Hua Jin got off the plane with Natalia in his arms, he was tossed and turned a few more times. The reason why Hua Jin described it as tossing and turning was because the security personnel wanted nothing more than to lay him flat on the ground, strip him naked, and inspect him from the inside out. Was the inspection so strict? Why did he have to go through such a stringent inspection when he landed on the island? It was as if he was an international fugitive. Hua Jin still had a lingering fear in his heart. Such a huge scene also frightened Natalia. If Gong Jie had not stopped her, she might have had to go through a retina and blood test. After the inspection, Hua Jin saw Gong Jie and asked in fear, "You're probably the first person I've seen who wants to go through a physical examination after returning home." Gong Jie, on the other hand, was already used to it. This series of inspections, no matter who it is, except for a few members of the Gong family, there are no exceptions. But Hua Jin asked suspiciously, "Why do we have to go through such a detailed inspection when we come to this island?" More than that. Gong Jie glanced at him. "While you're on the island, you'll be wearing a surveillance device. If you trespass into the restricted areas of Hurricane, you'll trigger the alarm of the entire island. Before you leave, all the restricted areas will be fingerprinted. If you go to a place you're not supposed to go, you won't be able to leave again." Hua Jin shuddered when he heard that. "It's just going home. Is there a need for so many complicated procedures? Don't you feel tired?" Gong Jie smiled coldly. "That's why I don't like to go home." Hua Jin was stunned. He didn't know why, but he felt his heart ache. At least, if he went home, he wouldn't have to go through such strict checks. This point, there was no human touch at all. For some reason, he felt like he was being tightly bound, and there was no warmth at all. Now, when Hua Jin turned back to look at the island shrouded in fog, he seemed to have another feeling. Suddenly, he felt that the magnificent castle was more like a prison than a home. Gong Jie gave Mu Yazhi a call. To his surprise, it was Yun Shishir who answered. Chapter 43:21. Shao Jie. Gong Jie was a little surprised. "Sister, you're awake?" He pursed his lips and suddenly felt a little uneasy. Perhaps it was because he had taken Gong Fan away while she was unconscious. He waited silently for Yun Shishir to flare up at him. However, the expected anger did not come. Yun Shishir's calmness surprised him. "Have you arrived at Hurricane safely?" Gong Jie was a little surprised that Yun Shishir did not scold him. "Where's Gong Fan?" "He's beside me." After a pause, he said, "Sister, don't you blame me?" On the other side, Yun Shishir sighed helplessly. "Why should I blame you, Shao Jie? Haven't you done enough for me?" Gong Jie was speechless. He said self-deprecatingly, "I'm sorry. I don't know what I can do for you, but I've done my best. Shao Jie, when I recover, I'll go to Hurricane to look for you." During this period, as his uncle, you must take good care of your nephew, okay? Yes, I will. Yun Shirshir did not say much, but he could hear the loneliness and exhaustion in her voice. It was as if she was holding something back, and her voice was a little hoarse. Perhaps it was because of their telepathy. Gong Jie felt that she seemed to have made a serious decision. Sister, yes? What are you thinking about? Gong Jie walked to the side and said worriedly, I have a feeling that you have a lot on your mind. After a long silence, Yun Shirshir finally spoke. If there's really no other way, I'm really willing to give up on Gong Fan. At this point, Yun Shirshir could not continue. She wanted to laugh to hide her heartache, but she could not hide it. I'm sorry to have worried you. All along, you've been indulging me and spoiling me, so much so that I've always imposed my own wishes on others. I'm sorry, Xiao Jie. Don't apologize to me. Gong Jie said somewhat angrily, Big sister, how are you being willful? You've been the most sensible one since you were young. You'd rather be wronged than let others be wronged. I'm the one who's willful. You've always tolerated me since I was young. Now that I've matured, what's wrong with me spoiling you? He had an insufferably arrogant aura, as if no one in this world could stop him from treating her well. Yun Shirshir was extremely touched. What had she done to deserve a husband like Mu Yaja, a younger brother like Gong Jie, and a pair of sensible sons like Yu Yu and Xiao Yichen? Thank you, but I've made my decision. I hope that I can be responsible for Yu Yu. I don't want him to suffer so much for me. Why is it for you? However, Gong Jie did not agree with her. Yu Yu is not only suffering for you, he also wishes to coexist with Gong Fan, isn't that so? Yun Shirshir was stunned. Do you think that he's protecting Gong Fan for you only because of your wishful thinking? He once told me that he feels indebted to Gong Fan. All this while, Gong Fan has suffered for him. Hence, what he's suffering now is also for Gong Fan. Yun Shirshir did not speak for a long time. Chapter 43-22. I understand, Xiao Jie. The call ended. At the same time, Lisa and Gong Fan had also finished their inspection. The 10-hour flight was too tiring. Gong Jie arranged accommodation for them, gave them some instructions, and went back to rest. Hua Jin came to the door of a room. The door was ajar. Natalia, who was behind him, poked her head out. Seeing that Hua Jin did not open the door, she asked curiously, What's wrong? Why don't you open the door and go in? Could he say that he was afraid? He was afraid that once he opened the door, he would appear in the surveillance camera's range. Previously, he had heard from Gong Jie that the Gong family was heavily guarded. Other than the room, no one was allowed to step into any other place. However, the room was not a safe place either. He felt as if there were countless pairs of eyes staring at him at this moment. Seeing that Hua Jin was in a daze, Natalia walked past him and pushed the door open. When she pushed the door open, what greeted her was a luxurious room that Hua Jin had not expected. The overall style of the room was champagne-colored. Pure white curtains, white solid with doors and windows. Upon entering the room, he saw an extremely luxurious walk-in closet. In the middle of the room was a luxurious four-poster princess bed. The champagne-colored curtains gently covered the edge of the bed, instantly giving off a dreamy feeling. This room was originally prepared by Gong Xiaoying for Yun Shirshir. In fact, this room was secretly prepared by Gong Xiaoying many years ago for Yun Shirshir. At that time, Gong Xiaoying did not know that Yun Shirshir was still alive. This room was personally prepared by him for his beloved daughter. Even though Gong Xiaoying at that time had a deep understanding that perhaps this room would no longer be of use, he still kept it. All the cleaning work in the Gong family was done by the servants. Only this room was personally cleaned by Gong Xiaoying himself. After finishing his work, he would often come here to sit for a while. For a long time, this room had been spotless. Later on, he accidentally found out that Yun Shirshir was still alive. After that, he returned to this room and sat there for the entire night. Gong Jie happened to pass by and heard Gong Xiaoying murmuring, "You're all grown up now. This room doesn't suit you anymore." Since then, the room had been left empty. However, it seemed that Gong Xiaoying rarely came. In the past, to him, This room was more like a spiritual sustenance. However, now that he knew that Yun Shirshir was still alive, there was no reason for this room to exist anymore. However, there were many guest rooms in the Gong family and there was no shortage of rooms. Normally, there was no need to vacate this room. But since Natalia was here, Gong Jie remembered that Gong Xiaoying had prepared this room for her. So, he arranged this room for Natalia. Wow. The moment Natalia walked into the room, she threw herself onto the bed in excitement. What a beautiful bed. I like this bed. Which is prettier, the bed at home or here? Hua Jin was just asking casually, but Natalia replied without hesitation, I like the bed here. Hua Jin's eyelids twitched violently. He seemed to have heard Gong Jie mention before that this room was decorated by Gong Xiaoying. What era was Gong Xiaoying from? Chapter 43-23. Could it be that his sense of beauty couldn't catch up with the people of the previous generation? Hua Jin's confidence was instantly crushed. Knock, knock, knock. Just as Hua Jin was feeling gloomy, there was a sudden knock on the door. Turning around, he saw Alice standing at the door. The door wasn't closed, but she didn't come in either. Instead, she stood at the door and said to Hua Jin, Is it convenient to take Natalia away? Hearing that she was going to be taken away, Natalia immediately shrank behind Hua Jin in fear and clutched the corner of his shirt tightly. No, she didn't want to go with Alice. She was leaning against Hua Jin as if he was her savior. Hua Jin glanced at Natalia and gently held her shoulders. He stroked her hair gently and turned to ask Alice, What's the matter? I want to do a checkup on Natalia. A checkup? Hua Jin couldn't help but feel sorry for her. She was on the plane for 10 hours and had to do such a long checkup. The child is exhausted. She hasn't gotten used to the environment yet and you want to take her away. Won't you? Alice heard this and crossed her arms. Why else do you think we took a 10-hour flight back here? It's not a complicated checkup either. We just want to check her basic values. We'll send her back right away. Hua Jin heard this and was speechless. Hence, he squatted down and coaxed Natalia, Go with Auntie Alice, okay? I'll wait for you here, okay? Where are we going? To do some checkup. He thought that Natalia would be unwilling and that she might cry and throw a tantrum, but she didn't. Natalia let go of his sleeve in disappointment. Her hands fell to the side as she nodded gently. Okay. She walked obediently to Alice's side. Although she was unwilling, she didn't say anything. Natalia, be good. I'll send you back later, okay? It was only when Alice took Natalia away that Hua Jin heaved a sigh of relief. However, as he wasn't familiar with this place, he stayed in the room and didn't dare to go anywhere. After such a long flight, he was extremely sleepy. Hence, he fell asleep as soon as he sat down on the sofa. Natalia and Gong Fan were brought to the laboratory. Alice first introduced the two children to the doctors in the laboratory one by one. This is Gong Fan, and this is Natalia. I've told you about them before. For a long time to come, our task will be very heavy. However, failure is not allowed. Do you hear me? Everyone was stunned and they were dumbfounded. Was not allowed failure? In the medical center, there were many experiments conducted every day, but Alice's requirements had never been so strict. Us not allowed? How was that? Only after countless failures would one be able to sum up their experience and achieve success. Natalia leaned against Gong Fan, trembling in fear. In front of her stood a circle of people in white coats. This made her feel as though she had returned to the place where she used to be. Vaguely, she recalled the time in the hospital. The pungent smell of disinfectant, the cold faces, and the white coats that always swayed in front of her eyes. Immediately, she felt a wave of disgust. Chapter 43-24. Natalia sized him up with trepidation. Gong Fan gently held her hand. Even though he didn't say anything, he only gave her a determined look. Natalia felt comforted. It seemed that with him around, everything became less scary. Alice discussed with the specialists for a while and clapped her hands lightly. Okay, it's settled then. She turned around and looked at Natalia and Gong Fan. She immediately said, Okay, now it's my turn to introduce you to my partners. This is Manson, this is Luca, this is Zach. Natalia realized that the doctors behind Alice all looked very young. They were full of vitality. This was the medical team that Alice had set up. It was the best in the world. However, it was such a top team in the world. However, the teaching staff were all young people who were only in their 30s. Moreover, this medical team was not only loyal to Alice, but it also showed that Alice's personality was unparalleled. Unless she personally dismissed this team one day, it would definitely be a success. Now, I'm going to come up with a plan for the two of you. Before that, I need to accurately understand your physical condition. Natalia, cooperate with me, okay? Natalia asked uneasily, will it hurt? If it hurts, it won't hurt other than taking blood. Oh, Natalia still had some lingering fear in her heart, but she still nodded resolutely. Gong Fan didn't need to say anything. He cooperated with Alice 100%. The two of them were sent for a series of examinations. At this moment, Alice suddenly received a call from Romanka. She was a little surprised that Romanka called. He rarely contacted her. Basically, if there was no special emergency, the two of them would communicate through email. Seeing that it was a call from him, Alice was a little cautious. After the call was put through, Romanka went straight to the point. How's Natalia's condition? Alice curled her lips. Everything is fine. At that moment, Natalia was right beside her. She held her phone and walked out of the room. Separated by a glass door, she made sure that Natalia couldn't hear their conversation. Then she slowly said, Professor, are you hiding something from me? On the other end, Romanka was clearly stunned for a moment. She hadn't expected her to ask such a question. Why do you ask? Do I need to tell you that? You should be clear about this. Alice didn't intend to delay any longer. She didn't want to go around in circles with Romanka. Natalia was now in her hands. From the moment she boarded the plane yesterday until today, all of Natalia's means of contacting Professor Romanka had been cut off by Alice. Therefore, Romanka could not get any information from Natarisa. It was probably because of this that he contacted her for the first time. Professor, I won't beat around the bush with you. I also hope that you can tell me the truth about everything. Romanka was silent for a while, but he only said vaguely, I don't know what you mean. Now, I'm no longer Natalia's guardian lawyer. I haven't even seen her in a long time. What do you want me to confess to you? Chapter 43:25. Confess her previous condition. Condition? Romanka pretended to be ignorant. As you can see, I've given you all the medical reports. Can't you study them yourself? Do you think I don't know? Several pages of Natalia's medical report are missing. Romanka was stunned. She was a little shocked by her words. But, are you surprised? Surprised that I would know that you tampered with the medical report? What do you mean by tampering? I don't understand. Alice lowered her voice and said, Several pages are missing from the report. If you didn't look at it carefully, you wouldn't have noticed it. You hid Natalia's medical report and then forged several copies of it and pasted them at the back of the report. The handwriting is too different. The previous page looks very old, and the new page is even several degrees wider than the previous page. Do you think I'm an idiot? You, Romanka, listen to me, Alice said very seriously. No matter what, I need you to cooperate with me. You're the most authoritative professor in this field. I still have enough evidence that you used Natalia to do those inhumane experiments. If you don't cooperate with me, I'll take you to the International Court of Justice. What you'll face is not only a high amount of compensation, but also your reputation. How about it? Is this condition sincere enough? Professor Romanka was silent for a long time. After a long while, he finally sighed. The younger generation will surpass us in time. He sighed and said, How should I meet you? Alice smiled relaxedly and finally relaxed her eyebrows. She knew that Professor Romanka's words meant that he was willing to cooperate with her. This also meant that her negotiation was a success. Alice said loudly, I'll send a private plane to pick you up and issue a high-level pass to Hurricane. It's my honor to be able to visit the world's top medical technology center in my lifetime. After telling him what to do and ending the call, Alice finally felt a little relieved. Professor Romanka was the world's most authoritative expert in the field of multiple personality disorder. If Lu Zhou could get his help, then his progress would be much smoother. Alice was also worried that Professor Romanka would harm Gong Fan. He seemed to have a great interest in Gong Fan. However, apart from those conspiracy theories, she was confident that she could protect Gong Fan as long as he was in her territory. Next, they could only take one step at a time. There was no need to rush Natalia's illness, but Gong Fan's situation was not optimistic. She could not wait any longer, and neither could Gong Fan. Before Professor Romanka arrived, Alice once again hypnotized Gong Fan. However, there was no breakthrough in the hypnosis. Yu Yu was also in this body and there was no news of her. Alice wasn't an authoritative expert in this field before, so she didn't know much about the world of multiple personalities. If Gong Jie had not repeatedly urged her to cure Yu Yu, she would not have dabbled in this field. However, if Professor Romanka was willing to help her, things would be much smoother. Chapter 43-26. During the half a month on the island, Gong Fan and Natalia had a relatively easy time. The two little guys got along well with the doctors in the medical center. During their free time, Hua Jin and Gong Jie would take Gong Fan and Natalia out to sea to relax. During this period of time, Yun Shishir would video call Gong Fan on time every night. However, the two of them were secretive about certain things. Gong Fan was well aware of his situation and cherished every day he spent with Yun Shishir. Even though they were half a world apart, the video call every day was the most heartwarming time for Gong Fan. Compared to the busy Gong Jie and Alice, Hua Jin was much more free. However, when he was free, he did not dare to wander around the island. It was said that the island was shrouded in a quantum defense network, and there were invisible mechanisms and alarms everywhere at any time. If they were triggered, the entire island would be armed to the teeth. Hua Jin was not familiar with the island, so he did not dare to walk around recklessly. However, the castle had all kinds of entertainment facilities. Billiard room, video room, gym. When he was free, even if Gong Jie was not around, Hua Jin would take the two little guys for a walk by the beach. Alice teased him that during this period of time, he had accumulated a certain amount of experience in taking care of children. When he had his own children in the future and became a father, he would not be flustered when it came to taking care of children. However, Hua Jin did not know whether to be happy or worried. It was hard for him to imagine that he would have a child of his own in the future. He already regarded Natalia as his own flesh and blood. Therefore, even if there was a chance in the future, out of consideration for Natalia, he might not have another child. Half a month later, Romanka successfully met up with Alice. That night, Romanka ignored the exhaustion of the flight and entered the meeting room with Alice. Other than them, no one else was allowed to enter. In the meeting room, Romanka told Alice a shocking secret. Actually, you're right. I did hide something from you. This. Romanka looked up and said with a serious expression, actually, Natalia is the real second personality. Alice did not expect that this was what Professor Romanka wanted to tell her. When she heard this, she was in a daze for a long time and did not come back to her senses for a long time. That day, when you saw the child in my hospital, the personality that appeared was actually Natalia. Compared to Natalia, Natalia's personality was a typical sensitive one. She is fragile, sensitive, and looks cold on the outside, but she is actually very gentle on the inside. All this time, I haven't told you because I don't know how to bring this up. You're lying. Alice was a little angry. How was that possible? How could Natalia be the second personality? Alice didn't dare to believe Professor Romanka's words. Even though she had hired this person to help her treat Yu Yu, she did not dare to fully believe Romanka's words. Hua Jin had mentioned it to her before. Professor Romanka might have taught Natalia hypnotism. Then he wanted to use Natalia to control Yu Yu. Chapter 43-27. However, she had never expected Natalia to be a second personality. Do you think I'm lying to you? Romanka leaned back in his chair with a serious expression. I know what you think of me. You must think that I'm an evil and unreasonable dark scientist who specializes in using weak and helpless children to conduct human experiments. Yes, Alice, to be honest, I have my own ambitions. multiple personality disorder was still unknown in this world. In fact, there were many people with multiple personality disorder in this world. The list of people with multiple personality disorder did not include people with multiple personality disorder all over the world. In other words, the patients we have now are just the tip of the iceberg. Alice, I want to conquer this field too much, so I seem a little eager for quick success. Perhaps, in your eyes, this is evil, but I don't think so. You don't have to think of me as evil. There's no need. Even though Romanka's tone seemed so sincere, Alice did not dare to believe him completely. According to what you said, could it be that Natalia's personality was created by you? Then why did you create such a personality? Alice was skeptical. This is your so-called personality society experiment? Not at all. In fact, the medical community has always believed that multiple personality disorder is a condition of nature. But I don't think that anyone can have this condition. So, I chose Natalia as the experimental subject. Natalia is a classic melancholic personality. So, in order to treat this personality disorder, I created the innocent, kind, and warm Natalia. I still don't dare to believe what you said so easily. This fact was too far from the answer she knew. She could not believe that Natalia was a second personality. Then, it meant that Natalia was the main personality that would never disappear? Then, can you explain why Natalia knows hypnotism? Romanka was finally surprised when he heard this. He didn't expect Alice to be so meticulous in her discovery. How do you know that Natalia knows hypnotism? She hypnotized Hua Jin and Yu. Although I don't know what level her hypnotism is at, it should be at a higher level of sober hypnotism, right? Romanka was stunned. He suddenly smiled with admiration in his eyes. As expected of Alice, your observation is so meticulous. Yes, I taught Natalia hypnotism because she has trouble sleeping. So, I taught her hypnotism and used it to control Natalia. So, it was through that crystal ball? This is unexpected. Romanka, how did you teach her? Chapter 43:28. For now, let's not talk about Natalia. Let's put this matter aside. Alice paused and leaned closer to him. She lowered her voice and asked seriously, is there really no other way? I don't understand what you mean. Although you don't know much about Yu's condition, I've mentioned it to you before. Oh, I get it now. You want me to work with you to come up with a treatment plan for Yu. But you don't seem to trust me. Look, you haven't even shown me a detailed medical report on Yu. Romanka looked at her calmly, his gaze probing. She sucked in a deep breath of cold air and said firmly, there's no way I'll report Yu's condition to you. Hearing this, Romanka laughed instead of getting angry. Look, you're not even willing to tell me his condition. How can I cooperate with you? Based on your words, even if you don't know his condition, you should be able to come up with a treatment plan. Alice obviously believed in Romanka's abilities. Romanka, however, what do you take me for? Do you think I'm a god? You're a doctor yourself. Don't you think it's unreasonable for you to say such things? Romanka paused and continued. If a doctor doesn't understand the patient's condition, he won't be able to come up with a treatment plan. Moreover, in the field of multiple personality disorder, it's still a difficult problem to overcome. Relatively speaking, even if the patient's medical record is complete, he may not be able to come up with a perfect treatment plan. Alice sat up in excitement. I can't delay any longer. If I really can't come up with a perfect treatment plan, then I'll use hypnosis to kill all the other personalities. Oh! Romanka's interest was piqued and he caught the main point. All the other personalities? Does this mean that he has already developed more than 3 personalities? Alice didn't expect him to be so meticulous. He actually caught the main point so quickly. You sound very anxious. It seems like Yu's condition has reached a point where he can't take responsibility? Romanka observed her expression as he spoke. Finally, he laughed and said, it seems like it's not as serious as I thought. After all, you're still unwilling to disclose Yu's medical record to me. It seems like it's not that bad. Alice had no choice. She had no other choice but to say honestly, I really don't know what to do. After all, I'm not an authority in this field, but you are. Now, I want to protect both Gong Fan and Yuyu's personalities. But something happened recently. What's the situation? Romanka's curious. He was assassinated in an unknown situation. Even Romanka, who had seen a lot of the world, couldn't help but frown when he heard this. Alice didn't bother to hide it from him and recounted the events of that day in detail to him. Romanka was silent for a while and immediately said, "It seems that he has undergone the second division." Chapter 43-29. There's a situation where one personality splits into two personalities splits into four, and so on. As for how many personalities can be split, there are no detailed records at the moment. There are at most 21 known personalities recorded in the records. Can dual personality really become multiple personality disorder? To put it in simpler terms, the emergence of dual personality disorder is when there's too much pain, a person can no longer bear it. Therefore, the mental state splits into a second personality out of self-protection mechanism. Then, when dual personality disorder evolves into multiple personality disorder, it means that the mental mechanism has begun to create a personality society. This personality society can be created by the patient himself, or it can be created by the outside world through certain means. Some theories suggested that multiple personality disorder was related to childhood trauma. Internationally, children before the age of 7 were considered to be the golden age of children. If a child suffered serious mental trauma before the age of 7, it was very likely that it would lead to mental illness. Multiple personality disorder was one of the possibilities. When a person suffered a strong impact that was difficult to deal with, they might try to close their eyes and empty their mind to reach the realm of "this did not happen to them." Then, they might create a personality that could replace them to bear the huge trauma and impact. This personality might immediately retaliate, become blind or deaf, scream, or curl up into a ball. Whenever similar pressure or impact appeared again, these personalities might automatically complete the transformation. Take Yu as an example. Li Qin and Yun Na's bullying in childhood. These tragic experiences tore apart a healthy Yu mentally, prompting the establishment of another personality. The two personalities could each perform their own duties and replace Yu to deal with different situations. Each personality of a patient with multiple personality disorder was stable, complete, and had different thinking patterns and memories. These split personalities were all-encompassing. They could be of different genders, ages, races, and even species. They took turns to control the patient's behavior. When the other personalities were controlling the behavior, the original personality might be unaware of what it had done during this period of time. This would lead to a serious time loss phenomenon. If the split personalities knew of each other's existence, it was called coexisting consciousness. They could even sit down for a meeting. My suggestion is that we use brain imaging to observe patients with multiple personality disorder. The difference in brain imaging between patients with dissociative identity disorder and patients with high and low hallucinations is very obvious. Then, what do you think Yu's situation should be? Do you want my suggestion? Alice nodded solemnly. If you really want to keep two personalities, it's not impossible. Treating multiple personality disorder was a difficult and very individualized process. Scientists and doctors had tried many methods for different patients. One of the most famous methods was personality fusion. The therapist understood and analyzed the patient's different personalities to find an internal personality that was familiar with all the personalities. It was usually called the internal helper and become the core personality. Chapter 43-30. However, even if the treatment was successful, the personality might disintegrate again due to external pressure. In addition, because the patient was highly suggestible, hypnosis was often used to summon the patient's different personalities for treatment. However, this was not a cure for the root cause. It was just a supplementary method. In fact, internal disintegration was not a special thing. It was a very common phenomenon. Ordinary people had experienced internal disintegration. For example, reading a wonderful novel and being completely immersed in the plot, completely unaware of what was happening around them. There were also daydreaming, meditation, forgetfulness, and so on. However, this was not an illness, but an ordinary daily mental activity. However, multiple personality disorder was already the extreme of such a state. I got it. Alice stood up. Then, let's start with the brain imaging. She had not done a brain imaging on Yu yet. The Hurricane Medical Center was very well equipped. Therefore, no matter what kind of examination it would not be difficult. As long as Yu was willing to cooperate. Romenka nodded. After that, Alice and Gong Fan had a discussion. When Gong Fan heard that he was going to do a brain imaging, he was initially a little resistant. However, after Alice explained what a brain imaging was, Gong Fan agreed to do it. It was not that he did not trust Alice, but he did not trust Romenka very much. However, with Alice around, the little guy still gave her some face. Alice brought Gong Fan into the examination room. In the examination room, there was no light. Only the faint blue light was quietly lit. In the huge examination room, there was only a very large instrument. It looked like an MRI, but it was not an MRI. The two instruments looked very similar. Alice instructed Gong Fan to lie down. His head was placed in a white helmet. Alice pressed the button and Gong Fan felt himself being slowly pushed in. Lie down obediently. I won't say anything. Don't move. Gong Fan was very obedient and agreed. Alice walked out of the door. Professor Romenka sat in front of the display screen and looked at the brain imaging screen. On the blank screen, a few black dots were listed. Look here. Professor Romenka gently tapped on the screen. The brain imaging differences between patients with dissociative identity disorder and those with high and low hallucinations are very significant. DID indicates dissociative identity disorder, CH indicates high hallucinations, CL indicates low hallucinations, TIS indicates trauma-related status, and NIS indicates neutral status. Alice looked at the image and sucked in a breath of cold air. Does this mean that there are 5 personalities residing in Yu's body? There are 4 active personalities. 4? How is that possible? Alice obviously did not believe him. Usually, only Yu and Gong Fan can change their personalities. Including the personalities that appeared that day, there should be at most 3 of them. How did the 4 of them come about? Are you sure you'll be able to distinguish the other personalities based on their appearance? When Alice heard this, she felt a chill run down her spine. Based on what you're saying, the other personalities have already appeared unknowingly, but we just didn't notice it? Just thinking about it made Alice realize how terrifying multiple personalities were. If there was a disguised personality, he would have been lurking for so long. Chapter 43:31. How would you be able to detect it? Romenka said half-jokingly, when other personalities appear, there won't be much change in appearance. At most, there will be a change in temperament. However, temperament is abstract. Moreover, you have already determined that the child has dual personalities, so naturally, you won't think of anything else. Alice frowned. So, you're saying that he has 5 personalities? No, what I mean is that there are at least 4 active personalities. Then, the personalities that haven't been imaged may not be shown, but as time passes, these personalities will appear like bamboo shoots after a spring rain. However, this will take time. However, the 4 personalities are at least active. Alice asked worriedly, then, do you think that the other personalities will have disguised behavior? I'm not sure about this. However, if we follow logical reasoning, it might be possible. Alice's expression became even more serious. What should we do? Romenka pondered for a moment. If you trust me, then submit his file to me. I'll try to come up with a treatment plan. I'm very interested in him, but don't worry. I won't do any messy experiments on him. I'll be careful. Alice hesitated for a long time. Romenka was also very patient. He looked at her quietly. Finally, he saw that she nodded reluctantly. Okay, I'll trust you this time. Alice brought Professor Romenka to the archives room. She pushed open the heavy door. There were dozens of rows of tall bookshelves in the archives room. It was all-encompassing and stored a lot of patient information and medical literature. Romenka was not in a hurry to urge Alice to look for Yu's medical report. As soon as he stepped into the archives room, His eyes widened in surprise. This is unbelievable. It's like a treasure trove. It's not wrong to say that it's a treasure trove. Ordinary people don't have the right to set foot in here. Even in my medical team, there are only a few people who have the right to set foot in here. Then I would be honored. Alice led Yu to a row of filing cabinets. The filing room was filled with high-tech elements. There were automatic bookshelves and pupil scans. Alice entered the relevant information and soon, Yu's medical report was pushed out. Alice carefully handed the medical report to Romanka and said in a deep voice, "Professor, we might as well try peaceful means before resorting to force. This file is very important, and it's the only one. You have to keep it properly. Also, if you have any ulterior motives toward Yu, we won't tolerate it." "Now, my personal freedom is in your hands," Professor Romanka said helplessly. "Aren't you being too defensive? I have no choice but to be on guard." Alice revealed her true feelings. Some researchers are willing to give up their lives and dignity for the sake of research. The truth is extremely important. For detectives, the results of their deductions are more important than their lives. Then, for medical scientists, if they can study difficult diseases in this field, of course, it's more important than their lives. Now that science is so advanced, you should know what it's built on. Chapter 43-32. Alice said softly, "It's built on countless failed experiments. But no matter what, you can't be a test subject. I hope you can make a clear distinction." "I understand." After Alice and Romanka's meeting ended, it was already very late. At this time, Gong Fan and Natalia had already gone back to rest. After leaving the research room, Alice stared at Romanka's back view and called for her right-hand man. "Ricky, send someone to keep an eye on him." "Yes." The assistant behind her was very strict. He asked in confusion, "Are you still worried about him?" "Not really. The main thing is that I have to be wary of Romanka, this old fox." Alice was very reluctant to hand over Yu's medical report to Romanka. But now, other than this, she couldn't think of a better solution. She could only hope that this old fox could come up with a useful solution. Romanka took the medical report and locked himself in the room. He was cooped up for more than a week. In this week, Yu and Gong Fan's personalities switched back and forth a few times. When Yu woke up just now, he saw himself on the island and was quite frightened. Early in the morning, Gong Jie was awakened by a commotion. He walked out of the room and saw Yu in his pajamas, standing in the corridor in a daze. He looked around and a group of people followed behind him. They were holding their coats in fear, afraid that the crown prince would catch a cold. Gong Jie walked over in confusion, thinking that he was Yu. However, when he turned around and the little guy spoke, Gong Jie instantly recognized that the child in front of him was not Gong Fan but Yu. "Uncle? Why am I here?" Gong Jie was also very surprised, but he quickly calmed down. He waved the servants away and took the cotton slippers and coat. The corridor was paved with marble. Gong Jie was worried that he would catch a cold, so he squatted down patiently and said to him, "Stretch out your leg." Yu obediently stretched out his feet and let him put on his shoes and coat for him. He looked up and asked in confusion, "Why am I here? This Ashland Island? This is a hurricane." "Hurricane? Didn't you come here before?" Gong Jie did not think much of it. Yu turned around and looked at the unfamiliar corridor. Even though he had been here before, he had never been to a castle before. He could not react to such a grand and majestic style. Yu looked around in confusion, still unable to understand. "Why am I in hurricane?" Gong Jie then realized that Yu seemed to know nothing about Yun Shishir's injury. What he did not expect was that Yun Shishir had been stabbed and was lying in a hospital bed at this moment. Gong Jie was a little hesitant. He did not know if he should tell him about this. However, Yu was extremely sensitive. He looked at Gong Jie's hesitant expression and raised his eyebrows suspiciously. "Did something happen to Mommy?" The boy was so agitated that he tugged at the corner of his shirt and asked anxiously, "What exactly happened? Tell me. Your mommy is injured." Yu was shocked and his face turned pale. "Injured? How did she get injured? Don't you have any consciousness at all?" Yu sucked in a breath of cold air when he heard that. Chapter 43:33. What exactly happened? Tell me quickly. Everyone suspects that Gong Fan stabbed her. That day, for some reason, Gong Fan lost control of his emotions and was sent to the hospital for emergency treatment because he accidentally took an overdose of painkillers. Gong Jie recounted everything that had happened to Yu, no matter how big or small. But don't worry, your mommy is fine now. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to stand in front of you so calmly. Yu knew that Gong Jie cared about Yun Shishir as much as he did. When he heard this, he calmed down and lowered his head. No one knew what he was thinking. Gong Jie asked tentatively, "What do you think?" "I think this matter is very strange. I think that when Mommy was stabbed, it was definitely not Gong Fan's personality. But it's impossible. Dual personality. How could there be other personalities living in my body? Then, I can't be sure if those personalities are dangerous. So, we brought you back to Hurricane. Alice has already worked with Romanka to think of a treatment plan." Yu's expression became even more solemn. He leaned against the railing and frowned. "What did Alice say?" "She didn't say anything to me. There doesn't seem to be any progress." In that case, Gong Jie couldn't help but be surprised that he didn't suspect Gong Fan. "Haven't you ever suspected that Gong Fan did this?" "Impossible." "Why?" Yu took a deep breath. "He cares about Mommy no less than you or me. I'm different. Other than Mommy, I have other people I care about. But other than Mommy, he doesn't care about anything. How could he do something to hurt Mommy? Impossible." Yu trusted Gong Fan more than anyone else. Since he was already on this island, it meant that he would have to cooperate with the treatment for a long time and wouldn't be able to go back. Since he was already here, he might as well make the best of it. Yu cooperated with everything. However, there was one thing that he insisted on. If the treatment plan had to kill Gong Fan's personality, then he would be the first to be unwilling. He believed that if Gong Fan died, his soul would be incomplete. Gong Fan and he were complete. The method he hoped for the most was for the two personalities to merge together. This was the most ideal state for both him and Gong Fan. During this period, Gong Fan and Yu's personalities switched back and forth a few times. 2 weeks later, Romanka finally walked out of the room and mentioned to Alice that he wanted to do a hypnosis experiment. When it comes to hypnosis, Alice is very cautious. Romanka knows her worries, so she mentioned that she can also be present during the hypnosis experiment. "What kind of hypnosis experiment was it?" "I want to create an illusion through hypnosis and summon the personalities of Gong Fan and Yu to meet each other." Roman paused for a moment before continuing. "However, during the hypnosis process, we can't rule out the possibility that other personalities will appear in the dream." "That's very dangerous." Alice realized the dangerous nature of this experiment. If other more dangerous personalities appeared in this dream and caused harm to Yu and Gong Fan, as outsiders, they couldn't interfere at all. Romanka nodded. "Before any experiment is mature, there will be risks. I have to make this clear to you. But there's no other way. This experiment has to be carried out." Chapter 43:34. That evening, Alice brought Yu into the laboratory to wait for Romanka's arrival. Sitting in the laboratory, Yu was obviously a little uneasy. He confirmed again, "I will be able to see Gong Fan in this hypnosis, right?" Yu suddenly felt a little nervous. Before this, he had learned from Alice that there were other personalities living in his body. This meant that the chances of him meeting the other personalities in this dream would be very high. In other words, he might meet the other personalities before meeting Gong Fan. "Are you sure that the people I saw in my dreams under hypnosis are my other personalities?" "Yes." "Then, if that personality looks the same as the other personalities, how can I tell them apart?" The reason why he asked this was because Gong Fan had written in his diary that he had dreamed of someone who looked exactly like Yu chasing after him. Gong Fan had suspected that this person was Yu. However, when he knew that there might be other personalities living in this body, he started to have doubts. Perhaps the personality who looked exactly like Yu was someone else. Yu suspected that there were two personalities living in his body that looked exactly like him. The appearance of multiple personalities might be the same, but the chances of them being different were higher. For example, there was a patient who had more than 10 personalities living in his body. However, these personalities had different appearances. There was a blonde girl, a middle-aged man, and even an FBI detective. Each of them played a different role. Alice felt a headache coming on. Yu, your condition is more complicated, so I can't say who you will meet in this hypnosis. However, you have to be vigilant. Why do you say that? Alice said with a serious expression, because in the dream, other than you, if the other personalities are fatally injured, they will disappear completely. Yu quickly understood what she meant and couldn't help but shudder. He didn't expect that this experiment would be so risky. He was a little scared. You mean that if someone kills Gong Fan in my dream, his personality will really disappear completely? What about me? You won't disappear. You have to remember this forever. Alice suddenly became agitated. Yu was shocked by her nervous expression. First of all, you have to remember that you are the main personality. In the dream, no matter what attacks you encounter, you will never disappear and never die. No matter what kind of injuries you suffer, even if it is real, you can't believe it, otherwise. Otherwise what? Otherwise, you will never wake up and let the other personalities occupy your body. Yu couldn't help but gasp. Chapter 43-35. Yu nodded solemnly. He didn't know why, but his heart felt heavy. I understand. I'll do my best to protect Gong Fan. When Alice heard this, she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Idiot, you just have to protect yourself. But as you said, even if I die in the dream, I still exist in the real world. But Gong Fan's life is in danger. I have to protect him. When Alice heard this, she fell silent for a while. She didn't know why, but she thought of Yun Shirshir's previous worries. She couldn't help but ask indirectly, if one day everyone gives up on Gong Fan, what will you do? Why would you give up on him? Yu expressed his confusion. I will never give up on Gong Fan. He is another me. He is the other half of my soul. If he disappears, then no matter how outstanding I am, I will be incomplete. Alice nodded in relief and scratched the bridge of his nose. You are such a gentle child. Soon, Professor Romanka arrived. He brought some tools necessary for hypnosis. When he walked into the room, he stood in front of Yu and asked with concern, Are you ready? This is a cup of milk tea. Professor Romanka passed the milk tea in his hand to him. Drink this milk tea. There is a small dose of sleeping pills in it. It's not much. Before entering the hypnosis experiment, Yu had to take some sleeping pills. Otherwise, it would be difficult for him to enter the hypnosis in a good state when he was extremely awake. Yu had just taken a sip of the milk tea when Romanka had already set up a dim table lamp. He turned on the table lamp, walked to the window, and drew the curtains. The huge room suddenly fell into a dead silence and darkness. The only light left was the table lamp in front of Yu. It was extremely weak. After drinking the milk tea, Yu still didn't feel much. He didn't feel sleepy either. He had enough sleep, so he was very awake. Professor Romanka sat down before him and greeted him in a friendly manner. Yu, hello, I'm Romanka. He extended his hand to Yu as if he was greeting a gentleman. Yu shook his outstretched hand and smiled. Next, we're going to start our experiment. Are you ready? Yes. All right, then let me tell you a story. First, lean back on the chair and relax your body. Yes, very good. He instructed Yu to adjust her condition. Then he softened his voice. Don't breathe too quickly. Be quiet, be quiet. Slowly adjust your breathing rate. He placed a piano metronome on the table and adjusted the rhythm. Then he instructed Yu to adjust her breathing according to the rhythm of the metronome. Next, Romanka began to tell him stories. It was a very boring fairy tale. Yu didn't know why Romanka was telling this story. Wasn't it supposed to be a hypnosis experiment? Why was he telling a story? However, only Alice knew that Romanka's hypnosis had officially begun without Yu noticing. Chapter 43-36. Yu didn't know when he lost consciousness. When he woke up again, he opened his eyes and realized that he was in a huge ward. The reason why he knew that he was in a ward was because when he opened his eyes, all he could see was a snow-white color. He could even vaguely smell the smell of disinfectant. His mind was in a daze. It took him a long time to adjust and realize that he was in the world that Romanka had hypnotized him. Was this a dream? Or was it a different dimension? He remembered that Alice had told him that after hypnosis, he had to keep his guard up against the people he met in this world. What might appear in this world might be the hidden and dangerous personality in his body. Yu immediately became alert. He got out of bed and looked around. After confirming that there was no one else in the ward, he began to rummage through the room. The ward was very big, and it was fully equipped with everything that was needed. In addition to the usual facilities in a hospital, there was medicine, needles. Yu was a little scared. He was especially afraid of such a space. He had been in the hospital since he was young and hated such an environment. Now that he was in such a space, it was inevitable that his heart would palpitate. Professor Romanka had said that he would summon Gong Fan's personality. However, if Gong Fan appeared, then the other personalities might appear as well. Moreover, he could not tell from his appearance whether it was Gong Fan or another personality if it was someone who looked exactly like Gong Fan. Yu picked up the scalpel on the cart and walked to the door. He carefully pushed it open. After pushing the door open, there was a spacious corridor outside. There was a long corridor on both sides. From his angle, he couldn't tell where the end of the corridor led to. Opposite the corridor was a row of floor-to-ceiling windows. However, the strange thing was that although the sunlight outside the window was bright and warm, it couldn't penetrate the window. It was as if it was isolated by an invisible enchantment. The sunlight outside the window was bright and beautiful, but it couldn't shine through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Therefore, the corridor was especially dark. Yu walked to the window and pushed it open. A strong gust of wind rushed in. He looked down and was surprised to find that the floor he was on was more than 10 meters above the ground. At a glance, it was about 5 stories high. Yu closed the door and looked around. After weighing the pros and cons, she finally decided to walk to the right. "Because I'm Yu," he muttered in his heart. This was probably a form of joy in the midst of bitterness. As he walked, he suddenly heard footsteps overlapping with his own. His hearing was exceedingly sharp. Alertly, he stopped in his tracks and leaned against the wall, trying to listen carefully to where the footsteps were coming from. What was even more frightening was that, when he stopped in his tracks, the footsteps stopped in an instant too. Could it be the echo of his footsteps? Was he so sensitive that he mistook the echoes as someone else's footsteps? Impossible, the sound of footsteps was much faster than his own. Yu took a deep breath and forced himself to calm down. Chapter 43-37. Alice had once said that no matter what happened to him in the dream, he was the main personality and would never die. Perhaps because of this, he was fearless and Yu had become more daring. He leaned against the wall and moved his feet slightly, listening carefully for the echo of his footsteps. There was no echo. Hence, he was relieved and started to walk freely with the intention of testing the waters. However, it didn't take long for the strange footsteps to be heard again. Moreover, it overlapped with his footsteps. Yu tried to distinguish the footsteps from behind. He pretended to be calm as he walked. Then, he suddenly turned around and looked behind him. In the distance, a black figure flashed past the end of the corridor. Obviously, the black figure was very alert. After realizing that he had been discovered, he quickly went into a room from the corridor. The door of the ward was not open. Hence, the black figure seemed to be sticking close to the door and curling himself up. Yu suddenly felt his limbs turn cold. This person was obviously following him. But what was his motive for following him? Yu took half a step back, suspecting the identity of the black figure. Could it be Gong Fan? Yu called out carefully, "Gong Fan." For a while, there was no movement. He stared in that direction as he slowly retreated, luring him out. When he moved, the black figure seemed to have heard the footsteps and thought that he had left. Hence, he appeared again. Yu saw the black figure slowly appear at the end of the corridor. Even though they were far apart, he could clearly feel that the person's eyes met his. Yu could not see his face clearly, but he could clearly feel that the black figure was slightly stunned. Gong Fan, is that you? His voice was slightly louder. The black shadow's footsteps paused. Then, it slowed down a little and walked towards him. Could it really be Gong Fan? Yu thought and walked towards him nervously. However, halfway there, he could clearly feel that the black figure's footsteps had quickened. No. He was not Gong Fan. Gong Fan was about the same height as him, but this black shadow was quite tall. Yu estimated that the black shadow was an adult male who was at least 1.8 meters tall. How could Gong Fan be so tall? It was not Gong Fan. Then who could he be? Yu suddenly remembered the dangerous personality that Professor Romanka had mentioned. Could this be it? Oh no. Could it be another personality? Yu took a few steps back and suddenly realized that the black figure had sped up and was walking towards him. He knew that something was wrong and turned to run. He had only taken a few steps when the black shadow behind him quickened its pace. Yu broke out in cold sweat. He almost didn't dare to look back as he desperately picked up the path and ran. At this moment, the huge hospital had become the battlefield of this chase. In such a big hospital, he almost didn't have time to think about where to go out. Seeing that the door of a room was open, he rushed in without thinking, turned around, and locked the door. Yu nervously leaned against the wall as he listened to the sound of hurried footsteps approaching. Then, when he reached the door, he suddenly paused as if he was judging something. Chapter 43:38. Who was this person? Just now, when they had looked at each other from afar, Yu could clearly sense a murderous look in his eyes. While holding his breath, Yu could clearly feel that the person outside the door had tried to turn the doorknob, but when he realized that the door was locked, he turned around and left. As the footsteps faded away, Yu heaved a sigh of relief and let out a long sigh. He's finally gone. Yu leaned against the door and turned around, only to realize that there was someone else in the room. It was a very big ward. Yu walked in quietly and suddenly saw someone sitting on the bed. It was a girl. She had long, black hair that fell over her shoulders. She had delicate features and looked to be about 15 or 16 years old. However, there was a hint of Yunshirshir in her eyes. She was leaning against the bed and looking out of the window. Her gaze was blank, so much so that even after Yu had entered the room, she did not notice his presence. She was wearing a hospital gown and was hugging her knees as she sat on the bed. She looked a little weak and pitiful. Perhaps because of the girl, Yu's vigilance was slightly reduced. However, at the same time, he felt that something was amiss. Why would such a girl appear in his dreams? Could it be that this was one of his personalities? Yu was a little suspicious. Who are you? Ah, Yu's sudden voice startled her. The girl lifted her head and looked at him helplessly. When she saw that it was Yu, she calmed down a little. Who are you? My name is Yu. Yu. The girl tilted her head. Obviously, this name was a little unfamiliar to her. My name is Shanshan. Shanshan? Yu smiled. What a nice name. He tried to get closer to her. Seeing that the girl didn't seem to reject him, he moved a little faster. He walked to the bed, but there was no place to sit. When the girl saw this, she immediately moved to the side considerately, leaving one side of the bed empty. Yu immediately said, "Thank you." Thus, he sat down on the edge of the bed. The girl smiled at him, but from her pale face, it was obvious that her body was not well. What happened to you? Yu was puzzled. You don't look well. Are you sick? The girl shook her head and hesitated for a moment before nodding. What happened? You're right, but it doesn't seem right. I'm sick, but I don't know what illness I have. Anyway, in my impression, I've always been locked in the ward. Not going anywhere? Yes, it's just me. Shanshan smiled. Actually, it's quite good like this. Although it's lonely and boring, sometimes I feel cheerful when I lean against the window and look out. Yu followed her gaze and looked out of the window. The view of the garden outside the window gave him a sense of déjà vu. It was as if in his memory, when he was young, he had been in the hospital all year round. He had been guarding a window all day long, and through this window he could see the view of the back garden. In the spring, many children who came to visit their relatives would play on the lawn. There was a gentle breeze and many kites flew in the sky, but he could only watch helplessly. Don't you feel lonely? Chapter 43-39. As the girl spoke, she raised her head and looked at him suspiciously. Who are you? Why haven't I seen you before? You did not know how to explain. He immediately changed the topic and asked, Are you alone? Don't you have other family members? Shan did not think too much and did not notice Yu Yu's intention to change the topic. She answered his question. I have a sister called Ran Ran. Ran Ran. But my sister always bullies me, so I'm a little afraid of her. If you see her, you don't have to tell her that I'm here. I don't want to see her. In other words, the various people in Yu Yu's childhood memories will become the shadows of the personalities in his body. Alice touched her nose gently and came to this conclusion. Professor Romanka nodded. That's about it. After Yu fell asleep, Romanka put on a brain monitor for Yu. At the same time, he used it to check his physical condition in his dream. Furthermore, he could also check the situation of the personalities that appeared. Through the test, Alice found that Yu Yu's brainwave frequency was sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sometimes calm, and sometimes fluctuating violently. Fluctuating violently meant that he was afraid. Alice did not know what Yu Yu saw in his dream to cause such strong emotional fluctuations. She sighed. Wouldn't it be great if I could enter his dream? If you interfere at this time, you might go crazy. Go crazy? Alice felt that it was a little unbelievable. Is there any scientific basis for this? For example, Yu Yu's mental strength is like a few orderly highways, and the different personalities are like speeding cars on the highway. If you interfere, what will happen when the cars drive into the other highways in the opposite direction? Collision. If his mental state is damaged, it will lead to disorder. Therefore, the consequences will be unimaginable. Of course, not everyone will be like this, but just in case, I don't recommend interfering with him. Understood. Romanka's explanation was easy to understand, so she could easily understand what he meant. Alice sat down on a chair not far from Yu Yu. She looked a little dejected. So you're saying that we can only watch from the sidelines and can't do anything? Yes. This is a deep level of hypnosis. It's different from the superficial hypnosis you did before. You can't interfere. You can only wait and see. Can you wake him up? Yes, but it needs to be done in a professional way. Alice was still a little uneasy. She wasn't an authority in this field, but Romanka was. If he secretly did something, she might not be able to detect it. It was because of this that she felt uneasy. Until now, she still couldn't completely trust Romanka. However, there was nothing she could do except ask Romanka for help. He could only pray secretly, hoping that things would develop smoothly. Romanka also sat down next to her. He knew that Alice was worried about him, so she didn't want to leave. However, he didn't mind. Chapter 43-40. Alice looked at Yu Yu quietly. Although she didn't show it on her face, she was praying that Yu Yu and Gong Fan would be able to get through this safely. At night, Yu Yu suddenly woke up. Alice was pleasantly surprised that he had woken up. She couldn't hold it in anymore. She had too many questions that she wanted to ask. However, Yu had just woken up and was still in a daze. Hence, she forced herself to calm down. How are you, Yu? Do you feel better? Are you more awake? Be quiet first. Romanka gestured for her to be quiet. Then, he brought a glass of milk and placed it in front of Yu Yu. However, little did he know that little Munchkin looked up and scanned his surroundings. He muttered to himself, "Where is this?" Then, he turned around and looked at him deeply. His gaze was obviously a little confused. Am not you? Alice and Romanka were both stunned. Gong Fan saw their strange expressions and couldn't help but worry. What's wrong with you, Yu? Did something happen? What's going on? Alice looked at Romanka worriedly. She seemed a little anxious. Where's Yu? Romanka also didn't expect this to happen. After all, no matter what kind of experiment it was, there would always be some unexpected accidents in every experiment. Now, he had encountered a troublesome problem. He had hypnotized Yu Yu, hoping that Yu Yu would enter the dream realm and find Gong Fan. Also, the two of them would work together in the dream realm to explore the potential personalities in his body. However, it was still an hour earlier than the time he should have woken up. What made Romanka and Alice even more unprepared was that the person who woke up was Gong Fan. This meant that Yu was trapped in the dream realm. If Yu wanted to wake up, now that Gong Fan had taken over his body, he would not be able to return to his original position. Romanka and Alice looked at each other worriedly. Gong Fan looked at them strangely and asked nervously, "What's going on?" "It's like this. We were originally conducting an experiment." Romanka explained the purpose of their experiment in detail. Gong Fan was very smart and immediately understood their intentions. In addition, he had heard Alice mention that they wanted to do such an experiment before, so he gladly accepted it. Alice said that Yu's ideal state was for the two best personalities, Yu and Gong Fan, to merge together. That would be the best outcome. He also agreed with this plan. However, in other words, if I suddenly wake up in this experiment and take over the body, Yu won't be able to come back, right? Alice said hesitantly, Yes, but it shouldn't be a big deal." "No, it's dangerous." Romanka suddenly interrupted Alice. "This time, Yu didn't sleep much as usual. I hypnotized him to enter the XY dimension, hoping that he can find the other personalities. When the time is up, he better come back. If he stays in that dimension for too long, I'm afraid that those dangerous personalities will appear and harm him." Alice said doubtfully, "The main personality will never disappear, right?" Chapter 43-41. "Are you sure?" Romanka questioned. "Although I also believe that the main personality won't disappear, there's always a chance. Although there's a chance, once it happens, it'll be an irreversible outcome." Alice was stunned and became even more nervous. "Then what should we do now?" Gong Fan suggested, "Why don't you hypnotize me and I'll go to that world too?" Romanka said, "You're already in that world. Even without hypnosis, you'll still go to that world when you fall asleep. However, if you're hypnotized frequently, your mental strength will decline greatly." Gong Fan insisted, "If I can't hypnotize you repeatedly, then I'll try to fall asleep myself. Is that feasible?" When Romanka heard this, he encouraged him and said, "Try it." Gong Fan nodded, lay on the chair, and closed his eyes. However, the stronger a person's goal was, the more active the surface of the brain was. Therefore, it was harder for him to fall asleep. Gong Fan couldn't fall asleep no matter what and couldn't help but feel anxious. He tossed and turned, but his consciousness became clearer and clearer. Romanka saw that he was forcing himself and sighed. "If you can't fall asleep no matter what, don't force yourself too much." Gong Fan opened his eyes, which were bloodshot. I'm worried about him." Alice asked, "Do you still remember where you were before you woke up?" "I was on an island." "An island?" Alice was a little puzzled. "Do you still remember what was on the island?" "Let me think." Gong Fan pursed his lips and thought hard, trying to recall the scene before he woke up. "I think there was a very beautiful manor." "Manor?" "Yes, but there were other things outside the manor. However, I usually only stayed in the manor and didn't go anywhere." "Are you alone?" Romanka perked up. "Did you see anyone else?" "No. I'm alone. The island is located on a sea and there's a port. I don't know what's outside the manor. I've never walked out of the manor." "I see. Oh, I remember. There was a car." Gong Fan frowned. "I remember that I tried to open the car door and drive out, but the car seemed to be locked. I couldn't find the key, so I didn't bother about it after that." In his memory, even though there was no butler, no servants, and no maids in the manor, everything seemed to be in order and was taken care of very delicately. The manor was filled with Chinese roses. This was Yun Shirshir's favorite flower. It seemed to have been projected into the dream world. When Alice was at a loss, Romanka suddenly asked, "Are you hungry?" Gong Fan was stunned. "Hungry, I'm a little hungry. Eat something." Then, Gong Fan was puzzled by his calmness. "What about you?" "At the moment, I don't have any good ideas. I can only wait for you to fall asleep, then wait and see. Waiting here won't change anything." Alice originally wanted to say something, but after thinking about it, she couldn't think of any feasible way. She could only eat first. Chapter 43-42. After dinner, they rested for a while. Then, Alice dragged Gong Fan to play tennis for a while. Previously, when Gong Fan was recuperating on Ashland Island, whenever Alice came to the island, she would play tennis with him for half a day. Firstly, she wanted him to exercise and train his body. Secondly, she wanted him to find some hobbies and interests. Unexpectedly, Gong Fan really fell in love with tennis. At that time, Alice was not around every day. When she was not around, Gong Fan would let Lisa play tennis with him. Now, Gong Fan knew that Alice dragged him to play tennis because she wanted him to use up his excess energy so that he could fall asleep faster later. Gong Jia and Lisa were also there. Alice could not take it anymore. She had been in the laboratory for a long time and had not exercised for such a long time. Hence, after a few rounds, she was already panting from exhaustion. When Gong Jia saw the two of them playing tennis, he became interested. Coincidentally, Alice was taking a break. Hence, he took the tennis racket from Alice and asked if Gong Fan wanted to take a break. However, Gong Fan said, "Just don't be a disappointment like Alice." When Gong Jia heard that his nephew had put up a banner for him, he was instantly filled with the desire to win. "Alright, when the time comes, let's see who's the real loser." Gong Jia waved his racket and started playing with Gong Fan. Don't say that. Gong Jia had really underestimated this nephew of his. In his impression, Gong Fan, who was also known as Yu, did not have a good physique. However, on Ashland Island, Gong Fan's physique had improved tremendously. Fortunately, Gong Jia was also good at sports. Otherwise, he might not be Gong Fan's match. However, in terms of tennis skills, Gong Jia relied on the strength of an adult and his height of 1.9 meters to suppress Gong Fan to a certain extent. After the tennis match, except for Gong Jia, everyone was exhausted. Gong Fan did not leave the stage the entire time. He was forcing himself to use up all his excess energy. This way, he would have a certain amount of excess energy when it came to sleeping at night. However, although this move was crude and brainless, it had a certain effect. At night, Gong Fan took a shower before lying down on the bed. The moment his head touched the pillow, he fell asleep not long after. After entering the dream, he looked around and realized that he had returned to the manor. He had fallen asleep. However, even if he were to fall asleep, the boy would probably not wake up anytime soon. That was because his body was too tired from overexertion. However, Romanka had said that Yu had come to his dimension. Even though he could not differentiate between dimensions, nor could he accurately understand them, he could vaguely sense that he might be able to find Yu in this dream. This way, even if he could not send Yu back to the real world, he could still do his best to protect Yu. Gong Fan pushed the door open and went to the garage. He found that the car was still there. The car was a Mustang sports car. The door was locked and he needed a key. Gong Fan remembered Romanka's words and went back to the room to search for the key. The manor was huge. However, Gong Fan was very familiar with this place. He went to the living room and rummaged through the cabinets. He found many keys. He identified them carefully and finally found the car key. He went to the garage and successfully opened the car door. Chapter 43:43. Although he was young and did not have a driver's license, it was not difficult to drive. There were not many complicated routes and road plans on the island. In addition, the car was automatic. One step on the accelerator and one step on the brake. He just needed to grasp the direction. Gong Fan got into the car and adjusted it to a suitable seat. He put the car in gear and stepped on the accelerator. He successfully drove the car out of the garage and away from the manor. Outside the manor, there was a long asphalt road. There were no cars on it. Gong Fan drove slowly along the road. There were some mountains on the island, but the mountain roads were not narrow. It was not difficult to drive. As Gong Fan drove, he looked out of the window. Unknowingly, he drove to a cliff. It was a dead end. Gong Fan sighed and had no choice but to turn the car around. The gauge showed that there was not much fuel left. There was no navigation here, so he could only activate the fuel-saving mode and step on the accelerator carefully, searching for a gas station along the way. After driving for about 7 to 8 kilometers, he finally saw a gas station. He parked the car and got out, but he did not find any staff at the gas station. The huge gas station was empty. There was no one there. Therefore, he filled up the gas himself until the dashboard showed that the gas level was full. He drove in the opposite direction of the dead end and the manor. There was no one on the huge island. It only gave off an inexplicable feeling of desolation. The sky unknowingly darkened. Usually, he only stayed in the manor and did not go anywhere. He did not expect the island to be so big. After driving for so long, he did not see anything beyond the mountains. Now that the sky was gradually darkening, Gong Fan felt that it was too dangerous to drive in the dark. Moreover, he did not find anything. Therefore, he thought that he should turn back and wait until after tonight. However, when he turned back because the sky was dark, there were suddenly dots of light in the distance that attracted his attention. Gong Fan slowed down the car and looked out of the window. He saw that the place where the lights were lit up was actually a few taller buildings. There was a huge Red Cross sign hanging on the roof. It seemed to be a hospital? Hospital? Gong Fan frowned. It was still not too late. Therefore, he took the opportunity to drive in the direction of the hospital. Although the hospital was close by from afar, the road on the island was very long. However, the roads on the island were winding and they wasted a lot of time on the way. By the time they arrived at the hospital, it was already late at night. He parked the car a little further away from the hospital and walked to the entrance of the hospital. However, he saw that only a few rows of the hospital were lit. The rest of the rooms were dark. Is there anyone in the hospital? How was that possible? Alice said that the dimension he was in was an XY dimension, and anyone who appeared in it was use other personalities. Could it be that there were other personalities in the hospital? If that was the case, could it be that the dangerous personality that attacked Yun Shirshir that day was also there? Gong Fan instantly raised his guard, lightened his footsteps, and sneaked into the hospital. The lights in the main hall of the hospital were not on, but the corridor was lit with dim yellow lights. It was unknown whether it was because of the lack of maintenance, but the light bulb was sometimes on and sometimes not, and the light was very bright. Chapter 43-44. At a glance, he felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. It was terrifying. Gong Fan stood in the hall in a daze, but he did not dare to speak. He gently took a step forward. When his shoes landed on the ground, they would echo in the air. He did not dare to take the elevator, but other than the elevator, it seemed that he could only walk up the stairs. He did not know why he wanted to go upstairs, but he vaguely had an intuition that was calling out to him. It was as if something was attracting him. He did not know if this intuition was good or bad. Gong Fan breathed repeatedly. He did not know if he should walk up. He lightened his footsteps and quietly walked to the entrance of the corridor. However, he was a little hesitant. He did not know what was waiting for him. Of course, Gong Fan's rationality told him that this was not a horror movie. There would not be any ghosts or gods. At the thought of this, he felt a little relieved. Even if it was ghosts or gods, he was not afraid. What was there to be afraid of? Gong Fan mustered his courage and went upstairs. Putting aside the flashing lights and shadows, there was nothing particularly scary along the way. He did not know where to go, so he simply followed the corridor all the way up. At the same time, he could also figure out how tall the building was. He didn't know how long he had been climbing. The long corridor was one floor after another, but there was no indication of the floor. He couldn't remember how many floors he had climbed until he saw a tightly shut door at the end of the stairs. Gong Fan hesitated for a moment, but he still climbed up and tried to push the door. He did not expect the door to be unlocked and could be pushed open. After twitching for a long time, he carefully pushed the door open a crack. First, he looked through the crack. Outside the door was a very large rooftop. From his angle, he seemed to be able to see a drying rack on the rooftop. On the rack were white coats and white bedsheets. There were many living rooftops like this in the hospital. Some doctors and nurses who lived in the dormitory would dry their washed work clothes and bedsheets here. However, other than that, he did not see anyone else. Gong Fan pushed the door open and walked out. The wind on the rooftop was very strong. In addition to the night wind was a little cold. He first walked around the edge of the rooftop. Standing on the rooftop, he could see the general layout of the hospital more clearly. There were a total of 3 rows of buildings arranged in a C shape, with a large garden in the middle. The building he was in was the southernmost building at the edge. Directly opposite was another building. He silently counted the number of floors on the opposite side because he did not know how many floors there were in this building. As he counted, he suddenly caught a glimpse of a strange shadow from the corner of his eyes. Only the middle rows of the building across the street were lit up. In the middle, which was probably the fourth floor, the lights were on. A shadow emerged from the far left and strode along the corridor. Gong Fan was shocked. He wasn't afraid, but he was very surprised that there was someone in the hospital. Moreover, judging from the shadow, it seemed to be a tall and strong man. Although he was far away and couldn't see his body clearly, under the light, the shadow was elongated. Based on the shadow, Gong Fan felt that his height should be more than 8 meters. Just as Gong Fan was secretly observing the man suddenly stopped in his tracks. Chapter 43-45. Under the moonlight, for some reason, a layer of fear shrouded Gong Fan's heart. Gong Fan subconsciously took half a step back and had an ominous premonition. At this moment, the man leaned against the window and looked in the direction of the rooftop where Gong Fan was. At this moment, Gong Fan was already on his guard and hid behind the drying rack. On the drying rack, the bed sheets were draped over the rack and stretched on the ground, just enough to cover his figure. Gong Fan didn't know what he was afraid of. It was just that subconsciously he didn't want this man to find out. This was his subconscious reaction. However, when he turned his head and looked at the moonlight in the sky, his heart suddenly jumped. In his nervousness, he had forgotten that even if these white bedsheets could cover his figure, under the moonlight, they would cast his shadow. Gong Fan's breathing was almost suffocating. He could vaguely feel that if that man's gaze was really looking in his direction, then he might have already been discovered. With the intention of probing, Gong Fan turned slightly. Through the bedsheets that were fluttering in the night wind, he saw from the corner of his eye that the man was really looking in his direction. Two pairs of eyes, separated by not too far, met in midair. He could even feel the man's sharp gaze. This man was tall, and one could tell that he was an extremely powerful man. Gong Fan recalled the time when Yun Shishir was stabbed and immediately equated this man with that dangerous personality. Oh no! Gong Fan instantly felt his scalp go numb. Since he had already been discovered, then there was no need for him to stick to hiding. He walked out from behind the bedsheets and saw that the man's eyes had regained focus and locked onto him. Following that, his shoulders were slightly arched, like a tiger waiting for an opportunity to hunt. The scene was at daggers drawn. If it wasn't for the distance between them, Gong Fan would even think that this man would pounce on him like a cheetah in the next second. His back was already covered in cold sweat. Gong Fan moved his feet slightly and slowly moved towards the door. The man looked at where he was. Then, as he watched him, he quickly ran in his direction through the corridor. He knew where he was and was about to start his hunt. At this moment, there was only one word in Gong Fan's mind. His intuition told him that this man was very dangerous, so he pounced toward the door almost at the same time. Walking down from the rooftop, it was the 10th floor. The man was on the 4th floor. There was some distance between them, but the figure of the man flying in his direction still made him feel a lingering fear. If she didn't run away now, the man would definitely catch up. After all, he was a grown man, so he couldn't be slow. But where could he run to? Gong Fan didn't have time to consider the man's identity. He only wanted to find a place to hide. As he ran in the huge hospital, the echoes of his footsteps made him feel as if someone was hot on his heels. This made him even more worried. Gong Fan groped through the doors one by one. Every door was either locked or a dead end. There was no place to hide at all. He didn't dare to place his hopes on the thin latch. He always felt that no matter how sturdy the lock looked, the door wouldn't be able to withstand a man's kick.